9. Family matters. There are times when nothing seems to go quite like you thought it would. Getting to the top of Sandstone Dome was one of those moments where my patience was sorely tested, both with my equine companions and my human ones. The horses, at least, had an excuse. It was very difficult to climb up the steep side of the stone with steel shoes and 4 hooves. Only my mare's trust, deserved or not, kept her from planting her front hooves and refusing to go a step further up the rocky face of, I'll be honest, cliff. However, neither Murtagh nor Brahm had that excuse. Not only were they less than impressed to find themselves working together, but they were, quite clearly, blaming me for it. Stuff it. Why can't they both just stuff it? Why can't they just, for once, have a little faith and— But of course they couldn't, and I really couldn't get too angry with them for it. It was Murtagh, and it was Brahm, two of the most cautious and untrusting people you could find in the whole of this world. They had good reason to be like that, but there was a time when such caution only became a hindrance for people who had to work around said caution. However, I had no choice but to work around it and hope, desperately, that I could somehow negotiate a kind of truce between the two. I do not hold much hope, however, after coming face first with the open hostility that they had for each other, and that was before either of them knew who the other was. After an hour of pushing, cursing, coaxing, stroking, and the occasional smack, we reached the top of the cave. It was a good 100 feet long and more than 20 feet wide, yet it had a small opening that would protect us from any bad weather or, even worse, prying eyes. The far end was shrouded in darkness. The shadows clung to walls like thick curtains. I studied it with a small sense of relief. Iragan and Saphira were already there, the dragon looking quite pleased with her success in discovering the place. We had made it this far, and it is a good idea to be grateful for the small things in life. Impressive, said Murtagh, looking around while he smoothed the sweaty coat of his dark grey destrier, Tornak. While he was clearly less than amused to be spending time with us, Murtagh was being surprisingly polite, and I felt a small well of gratitude grow inside of me. I'll gather wood for a fire. Brahm looked like he was about to protest, but I stepped on his foot. Hard. That sounds excellent, I said before Brahm could say anything, and I just kept smiling as if that was the best plan in the world. Murtagh nodded and secured his horse before leaving. I turned to look after my mare, and a brief 30 seconds later, Brahm began his tirade. It was tirade directed straight towards me, my decisions, and whatever plan was going through my brain because, according to Brahm, it was clearly insane. Brahm did manage to his voice low enough so that Murtagh could not have heard if he was eavesdropping, but he did not manage to hold back any of his verbal punches. Iragan and Saphira, looking rather wary, chose to stay out of it, and they kept close to the entrance, as if wanting a quick escape in case things got nasty. They might have got nasty because not only was Brahm in a foul mood, but I was in an even fouler one. In a voice that quivered with emotion, Brahm was really getting on a roll. What do you think you are doing? How can you trust him? I thought you had some sense in that brain of yours, but you are acting like a fool. A fool who blindly puts her trust in the nearest stranger who so happens to have a butcher for a father just because they think that person is. Before Brahm could go any farther, I put a hand across his mouth and met his intense glare with one of my own. I was angry with him. I was angry with the lot of them. I was furious that they had forced me to do what I had had to do because, in the end, I was nothing more than a terrified little coward who didn't know anything about who she was or what she had to do. It felt as if I had done so much to make sure that fate did not play out as it should have, and now, just as I questioned my actions, they questioned my judgment. I was already terribly unsure and frightened of what I had just done to the fabric of the future. Brahm was not making that any easier. My anger, no, my fury with the changes that had been forced on me suddenly boiled over as I glared into the eyes of Brahm. They had not been changes I would have chosen, and I felt as if my entire life was speeding forward, so out of my control that, even if I had wanted to, I could not stop it from gathering speed until it careened into disaster. Because, do you know something? I had done more than I had thought I was ever capable of to make it to this place at this time, and in this way. I had killed, I had struggled, I had cried. I had slept on the ground and eaten whatever I could find or catch. I had given up on seeing my family again or laughing with one of my friends. Yes, I had given up on a lot of things, and the magnitude of my sacrifices suddenly hit me with the weight of a speeding train that seemed loaded with unfairness and homesickness. So now I was the foolhardy idiot. I am the errant child who needed to be scolded. I am the one who is doing everything wrong, and because of this, needs an adult to step in and take charge, because I am clearly not up to the challenge. I am such a child, am I? I know nothing about anything, and I am going to get everyone killed or captured. Is that what you are saying, Brahm? Is that what I am? My emotions boiled over as I leaned forward so I could hiss my next words in as venomous a voice as I could summon. I felt the anger building behind my words like the rising power of a wave. I needed to let it all out, to let all of this out, and Brahm had merely provided the outlet. He had provided the perfect outlet for my anger, my frustration, my homesickness, and my doubt. Because I was filled with doubt and all these ugly emotions that I tried my best to ignore, but I could ignore them any longer. The man moved back a step, unnerved by the obvious anger I showed. It was first time I had lost control of my temper around any of them. You listen to me, old man. I have killed. I have fought just to make sure you live to see another day. I have given up on ever getting home to my family. Do you know something? You should be dying from a mortal wound as we speak, but you are not. Do you know why you are not? I will tell you. Because I chanced a gamble with fate and saved your life. Do you have any idea how hard it has been to choose between potentially destroying the future of this world and saving you? No. For once in your life, you're going to have to trust me when it comes to Murtagh. You can stop making everything so difficult and find some common ground with him, or you and I will have another discussion, and you will not come out of it in one piece. I did not realize that, as I loosed my tirade at him, I had gripped the front of Brahm's clothes and our faces were inches apart. He smelled terrible, and I probably didn't smell any better. With a final glare, I let go and whipped around. I reined my temper and settled for glaring at Eragon and Saphira before I marched towards my mare and began to unsaddle her. Brahm did not move from where he was standing, and his eyes were still wide in surprise and shock. Good. I wanted him to be shocked. The minutes passed in uncomfortable silence until Murtagh reappeared in the mouth of the cave with a stack of wood. I smiled at him and helped him start the fire, though, of course. He wasn't sure he liked having me so close, and had to do everything one-handed because he couldn't take his right hand off his sword hilt. I found it terribly amusing, and when it actually came time to light the little fire, I had to do it because one can't start a fire one-handed unless one is a magician. But then it was time, and any levity fled me as I prepared myself for what was to come. When a small breakfast was cooking on the fire, I cleared my throat. Everyone looked at me expectantly, and I tried to organize my thoughts. I knew what I had to do, and better now than never. The sooner everything was out in the open, the better. There were too many things that had gone unspoken for too long, and in such a world, one never knew when the chance to tell them would be destroyed. But I also had secrets that would be exposed in this telling, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that either. However, I had landed myself in this mess, and it was my responsibility to clear it up. Facing the quiet, intense stare of Son of the Morzan, I began there. Murtagh, I know that you have been traveling and hunting the Razak just as we have. However, we have more in common than just the same quest. I stopped and continued trying to ignore Brahm's angry stare that burned into the back of my head. He had not forgiven me for my angry words, and both of us were too stubborn to apologize. Especially as we both believed we were in the right. Tough luck, Brahm. Murtagh was watching me silently. He had removed his hood, and I had to admit that he was handsome in a rugged, bad boy sort of way, but that was the farthest thing from my mind. There isn't much time to think about how cute a boy is when one is about to drop something as big as I was about to drop. One last steadying breath before I took the plunge into the cold, dangerous waters of the truth and the past. I met his eyes and said in as even a voice as I could muster, "Both you and Eragon have the same mother, Selina." I had been prepared for it. How could I not have been prepared for it after thinking about this moment for weeks and weeks of solitary travel? Eragon and Murtagh began to speak at the same time. Just a second. What do you mean? How could? I had to grab both their shirts to get them to listen to what I trying to say. My headache increased from a dull ache to a throbbing pain behind my eyes, but it was too late to back out now, and this had to be finished. Shut up, you two. Listen. They did shut up, but they did so with clear reluctance. Safria was just listening. A dragon's patience is a wonderful and remarkable thing sometimes. Brahm looked like he was planning the flowers he wanted on his coffin. Another deep breath, a small prayer, and then I began to tell the story that I had once read so long ago, and in such a different place. I hadn't really cared for it. It had been just another love story, and not very original at that. However, when one faces those who were actually involved in the story of Selina and her life, well, things change. Things become terribly and tragically real because, suddenly, those ink words you once read on paper become flesh and blood people. And now I was telling a story that should not have been told by me. It should have been told by Selina or by Brahm, and not by a teenaged girl who could barely cope with the stories she already knew. I started with Selina's departure with Morzan, and then went from there. Breakfast sat untouched as everyone listened to my words in complete silence. Of course, one thing led to another, and I had to explain of my own arrival, my journey to Drasleona, and what should have happened last night. It wasn't easy, and there were some things I glossed over, because I didn't see the point in retelling them. I tried to answer all of the potential questions I was sure Aragon would have for me before he asked, but many of them could only have been meant for Brahm. The old man was the only one who could answer Aragon in full or explain just a few of the motives behind the choices that had led us all to this point. Murtagh, meanwhile, just watched me with an inscrutable expression on his dark face. Finally, I stopped, because finally the story had been told, and now all that remained was the future, and that I could not and would not tell. The sun was high in the sky, and I was exhausted as well as starving. My breakfast was unappetizing bit of gruel that looked more like something from my boarding school cafeteria than I was comfortable with. There was a reason I always asked my parents to send me food parcels. Murtagh was the first to break the long silence. His gaze had moved from me to Aragon, whose eyes kept flicking between Brahm, me and Murtagh as he digested this new knowledge. At last, in a voice that was low, I had almost didn't catch the words, Murtagh spoke. This is a lot to take in, but it makes sense. Good, I said, relieved that at least one person was taking this well, or as well as it could be taken. If you three want to talk, I'll be over in that corner, catching up on some sleep. I rose and walked over to the corner farthest from the entrance to the cave. I felt the need to distance myself from them and allow them a chance to discuss matters without my awkward presence. The shadows were thick on this side of the cave, and I could feel sleep calling for me. It was hard to find the energy with which to spread my blanket, and once it was open, I practically collapsed on the hard ground as the last of my adrenaline left me. But I could not just sink off to sleep like I would have dearly liked to. Stretching out my mind, I murmured, Saphira. The dragon opened up her mind to me. What is it, Zoe? Will you make sure that those three don't get carried away? I worry that Brahm's feelings about Murtagh may cloud his thinking. The dragon nodded her great head and said, I will watch them. Sleep well, Zoe, and thank you. I smiled and fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. One part of this journey was over and another, even more important one, just begun. I couldn't help but laugh inwardly as I thought of all that had occurred these past weeks and the things I had been forced to learn. Part of me dearly wanted to shout into the clear morning air, stuff the consequences, fate, and stubborn old men. But I didn't, for that would be tempting fate even more than I already have, and besides, I was already asleep. He did not know what to make of that girl. Murtagh, son of Morzan, did not know what to make of anything any more. The last few hours had forced him to reconsider everything he had once taken for certain about his family and the people he had always considered to be enemies. It had forced him to reevaluate what he thought he knew about girls. Brahm and Aragon had both fallen asleep. The dragon was on watch, but neither Murtagh nor Saphira spoke or looked at each other. It was a kind of unspoken agreement between them of, if you don't doing anything, then neither will I. The girl, Zoe, was curled up using her pack for a pillow on the far side of the cavern. Her face and most of her body was concealed by shadows. Murtagh stared at the shadows that engulfed her as he considered the events of the past 12 hours. He should have tried to sleep, but rest would not come to him after all that had been spoken of. Who could have slept after having their world turned upside down by a girl who claimed to be from another world? Who could have found rest when their father's killer was a few short feet away? Not only did Brahm of the Varden seem ready to repeat the act and kill me if I so much as lifted a finger against any of them, but no, the list of why he could not sleep went on and on. With a heavy sigh, Murtagh leaned against the smooth rock of the cavern as he drew his cloak tighter to ward off the faint chill that the stone emitted. His mind, while it could have lingered on many things, returned to the girl Zoe. As a general rule, he tried not to think too much of his father or mother or the reason for his running away from the king. Some things, he had come to learn, were better not thought of. But Zoe was new territory, and he couldn't stop himself from wondering about her. She could have passed as a noble. Her bearing and manner of speech had, at first, marked her as upper class in his eyes, and he had been quite ready to find out she was the runaway cousin of such, and such a noble or wealthy merchant who he knew from the king's court. He had thought her just another girl trying to flee an arranged marriage or seeking adventure after reading too many books. However, that story had been effectively quashed, and now he found himself struggling to make a decision that, a few hours ago, would have been quite easy for him to make. Trust the girl or not. He was Murtagh's son of Morzin, and trust was not something that came easy to him. There had been his mother and his mentor, Tornak, but they had been exceptions to his general rule of, do not trust. Was Zoe another exception? Could the grey-eyed, fiery, tempered girl who not only knew his past, but did not condemn him for it, could she be another exception? He did not know, and he was surprised that he was even willing to consider it. Then there was Iragan. He looked young and inexperienced to Murtagh's eyes, but he seemed willing enough to give him a chance. Was it only because Zoe had made it clear that she expected it of them both? Murtagh wasn't sure how he felt about the rider, or the simple fact that he was not only his half-brother, but the reason Selina had died. If she had not been so desperate to save Iragan from the king, then she would not have risked the long journey to Carvajal. While Murtagh had been fighting survival among the backstabbing, sweet-smiling courtiers, Iragan had grown up in safety with a loving family in a remote and secure valley far from the king. Murtagh could have come to accept all of that. With enough time, such things can be accepted even if they remain rather painful. However, it was something else that made Murtagh dislike the rider and wish he had never encountered this strange troop. He had Zarok. Morzen's sword should have gone to his only son, Murtagh. The one thing that the young man had expected to inherit was now hanging at his younger brother's side. The whole situation seemed so brutally unfair that it hurt him just to think about it. But like many times before, Murtagh had to be the one who overcame the injustices of life and accept it. For what? Because a girl that he didn't know told him he didn't have a choice, that this meeting between him and Iragan had been preordained in another world. Perhaps he would surprise himself, and perhaps he would become friends with the rider and the dragon. Stranger things have happened, and after all, Murtagh had known them for what? A couple of hours in which they hadn't been present, and Murtagh had been concerned for his life because of an old, sword-wielding man and furious young woman. Tornak would have wanted him to give it a chance, and while Murtagh didn't think what most people thought of him, he still wanted to make Tornak proud. The man might be dead, and he might be dead because of Murtagh, but he had been too big a figure in Murtagh's life to be so causally forgotten. The young man tapped a finger against the hilt of his sword. The doubts always crept back in, but he was too weary to think of them now, or the many possibilities that he would still end up back in Urabine as the king's ward. He had always wanted to believe that there was more to him than his parentage and the burdens that placed upon him. Perhaps, in the offer extended by Zoe, he could find the life had always eluded him when he lived at court. Turning his face to look out the mouth of the cave, Murtagh studied the landscape that spread out before him. The warm light eased a few of his worries, and a small, almost unnoticeable little flare of hope grew within him. He had delusions about Brahm, but I sensed that he would be willing to agree to a sort of truce if I proved my worth. As for Iragan and the dragon, Saphira, he would see what happened there. And then there was Zoe. He didn't know what to make of her or the offer of trust, of friendship. She had decided to extend to him without seeming to mind that it could be rejected or that, even more importantly, it should not be offered to someone like him. It was strangely touching that she had offered, however, and spoken to him as if he was an ally and not an enemy. If only because of that courtesy and quiet acceptance, he would consider the offer and words she had spoken. Well, he would do his best with the cards he was given and hope that in the end he didn't destroy everything. The future was, to his eyes at least, clouded, and he did not feel the need to search for things that may or may not be there. But for now, with the morning sunlight warm upon his face, he felt more at peace than he had for a long while. Another chapter for you guys. Let me know what you think of it and check out my changes to the earlier chapters. I am still working on my revisions, but it's coming. Again, thank you for reading and please review. It really does inspire me to get writing and posting. This is an edited chapter posted on January 6th, 2014. Note posted on January 6th, 2014. Hey Booklover19, I know you are reading this story from the beginning, and I love your comments. Thank you so much. But I am going to warn you, this story is in the process of being rewritten, even as I am writing the future chapters. And as you continue, you may notice that some chapters seem more mature and developed than others. Maybe a big difference. Lol, these are the chapters that I have adjusted because, as you pointed out, I have grown as a writer, and I understand my characters better than I did before as well as the direction I want them to go. I am also better with grammar, and not so worried about posting things quickly, but more focused on length and content. Once more, thank you for your support and interest in this story. It means a lot that someone would want to go through this story so meticulously, and I feel quite honored. I hope you manage to wade through the choppy waters of my attempts at writing a good story. It does get smoother as you go. Jay, I promise it does. 10. Swordplay. The sun was just setting when I finally woke. I must have been more tired than I had originally thought. Relishing the feeling, I slowly pushed myself up and stretched. I felt refreshed, and without exhaustion clouding my thoughts, I felt even more troubled than I had that morning. We needed to leave, and we needed to leave soon. Lingering in this place was not only dangerous because of the Razak, but dangerous for the timeline I was struggling to keep us on. I'm not even sure why I keep trying to stick to it, but I do. It makes me feel better to try. I glanced over and saw Murtagh bent over a small fire along with Iragan, but Brahm was still lying down by Saphira. I could hear him snoring gently. The sight of his sleeping form made guilt rise within me. Would he forgive me for my harsh words? Looking back on it, I realized just how short I had been with him, and it made me feel slightly guilty. I would need to apologize at very least. He had not deserved my anger when his concerns were justified. I pushed myself upright, ignoring my stiff muscles, and made my way to the small fire. Saphira acknowledged my presence with a blink of her eyelids, but said nothing. Both Iragan and Murtagh looked up when I sat down beside them. A small part of something was cooking over the fire, and my stomach rumbled in hunger. I met Murtagh's dark eyes and smiled slightly. As much as I hated to make small talk, it seemed that it was required if I wanted to break the deep silence that had fallen between the four of us. What's happened while I've been asleep? Iragan shrugged and said, Not much. Brahm was awake briefly, but then went back to sleep. Murtagh and I have been talking. He looked at Murtagh briefly, and I wondered what they had been talking about. Iragan seemed more relaxed with Murtagh and vice versa, so I decided not to question it. This would take time, and I was beginning to feel like the odd man out at a family reunion. Murtagh leaned forward and raised his dark eyes to mine. They reflected the light of the fire, and the intensity of them made me feel as if he was looking right into my mind. I automatically tensed slightly and drew my mental shields even closer together. In a soft voice, Murtagh said, You never said yesterday what your life in this other world was like. Iragan said you are skilled with both swords and a bow, but not how you gained that skill. His voice took on a bitter tone as he said, You know so much about me and my life. I think it is only fair that I know more about you. Even Iragan and Saphira drew closer. I had spoken so little of my world to them that they were curious. I crossed my knees and looked out of the small opening and outside towards the darkening sky. My mind whirled as I thought about what I could say to try and explain how I felt and where I came from. Since arriving in this land, my view of my life, my world in general, had changed drastically. I had memories that I should not have, skill that I had not worked to gain, and knowledge that could save or destroy an entire world. How would I explain that without totally overwhelming people who didn't even know what Earth looked like? My world was so different from this one, and so far away right then. It was hard to believe these days that it was where I was from, and even more frightening, could I ever return there? So I began where I could because, maybe, if I tried to explain what it was like to be here, and why it was so different then, I could somehow find a way to talk of other things that seemed so distant. There was also the matter of my visions, which I had never spoken of with Aragon and Sapphira, or even Brahm. Would they resent me for not trusting them enough to tell them? I could only hope they would allow me to explain just a few of the things that I had experienced these past weeks. No, these past months now. Finally, I said, I had a very good life back home, but like so many things, you never appreciate it until you lose it. I came from a family who had the money to ensure that I would have every opportunity to succeed. I never learned weapons, nor did I need to. I was never in life-threatening situations, and never expected to be. I twirled a strand of hair around one finger. I was so bored and fed up with that life, not because I wasn't good at it, but because it felt like I was living a half-life. I wasn't really that girl, but just playing at it. I longed for an escape, an adventure in which I could make myself someone completely different, or maybe discover who I really was. I paused and looked up quickly to Murtagh and Eragon before turning away, unable to talk to them directly. It felt strange to be trying to put all my feelings and emotions into words. As I've traveled through Alagaesia, I've come to realize that there's something far bigger at work. I woke up in this world able to wield a sword, and many other skills I never had, did not know were possible to acquire, and would never need anyways. To answer you, Murtagh, I feel like I am discovering a whole different part of myself. There are memories that I cannot quite reach. On my journey here, I realized that I am not sure I want to know what those memories are. I feel like there is so much more I have to learn and discover before I can even guess at why I am here or how I came to be here. It's like a puzzle in which I can only see a few pieces, and they do not match at all. I smiled bitterly and turned my eyes to look at the three listeners. My finger stopped spinning clockwise and began to spin counterclockwise so that the strand of hair quickly unwound. Murtagh nodded in understanding, though he also did look a little confused. Stirring the stew in the pot, he said something that would linger with me through the following weeks of travel. Tell me more when you know more. There was something about the way he spoke it. He said it as if it were a challenge or a question worth extra points in an exam. It wasn't easy, and it would do whatever it could to trick me up, but it was something worth thinking about. I couldn't forget it, and it would haunt my thoughts when I had nothing to distract myself with. But the moment was broken a second later when Murtagh asked curiously, "What is your world like? Is it like this one at all?" He looked so curious, and so like Aragon right then, his dark eyes glittering in excitement, and his voice eager as he asked me the question. Was this the same person that he had been just a few minutes ago? The watchful, untrusting, and angry with the world Murtagh was gone for a few brief moments. It made me strangely glad to see this other side. I laughed slightly and said, "If you want to know about my home, then hurry up with that dinner." The comment broke the ice like nothing else could. Even Murtagh smiled as Sapphira and Eragon laughed. I leaned back against Sapphira's warm bulk and began to describe my home as best I could. For how does one adequately describe a place with airplanes, iPhones, and atomic bombs? There was much I just couldn't describe, and so I did not mention it. Some I did not want to speak of in this land, for, while it was violent, it had no need for things like gunpowder. I spent the rest of the evening telling them of my world. I enjoyed it, and it felt so like the dinners I had with some of my friends back home, laughing and telling jokes without a care in the world. I even tried to sing a few of my favorite top 20 hits and told a few old Greek myths. We never raised our voices, and Sapphira watched the forest below us carefully for any sign of the Razak, but it strengthened the bonds of friendship and created new ones where there had been no connection before. And little oblivious, me did not realize that Brahm was watching us. I only realized it when I made my way back to my bed. It isn't a bed, but it makes me feel better to call it that, that I suddenly realized I had not heard a single snore from him all evening. It unsettled me for a brief moment, and then I smiled slightly as I looked over at him. What had he thought of all that was said that night? Had he wondered at seeing both Selina's sons enjoying each other's company? I lay back down on the hard ground, and within a few minutes I was fast asleep. My dreams were of home, and when I woke the next morning, it was with a feeling of peace, though I could not remember exactly what I had seen. It was as if I seen things that gave me great comfort and resolved all my endless questions. But the following morning I could not remember what those answers had been. He had never thought this day would come. Brahm had never imagined this. Since when would the son of Morzan not only share their camp, but travel with them for undetermined and unspoken time? Selina, he supposed, would have been happy. It had always been her wish that her eldest son escape the shackles placed on him by the king, but Brahm was struggling to accept this new companion and the weight of what had happened in the past. Brahm watched as Murtagh reached the base of the sandstone hill with his grey warhorse, Tornak. He still did not trust the boy, but then who would? As it was, he had to trust Zoe and hope that the boy did not betray them. It went against all his instincts, but he would give it a try if only because he had seen more than a little desperation in Zoe's eyes. When all of them had mounted, and Saphira had taken flight, they began the slow trek towards Gilead. Brahm had chosen to travel towards the city after speaking to Zoe privately that morning, while both Murtagh and Eragon had been occupied with clearing camp. She had explained that it was important to follow the story she knew as closely as possible. However, to the man's growing annoyance, she refused to tell him anything except for vague, cryptic words that just served to confuse him. He knew he couldn't blame her for her secrecy. Guards knew he carried enough secrets himself. However, he did wish she would trust him with some more information, especially as they were traveling towards one of the most heavily populated cities in the Empire. It was dangerous for them to travel anywhere near the place, and even more so after the incident with the Razak. And he was curious, insatiably, terribly curious about what she knew even as he refused to allow himself to ask. What things did the girl carry? It must be a heavy burden to look at someone and know that they would fall or they would live or they would lose all they loved. There had been times when he had regarded her with open wonder. How did she manage to control herself, to bear momentous knowledge in complete silence, as if it did not matter? She was a mortal, a young one who was entirely unused to such burdens. He had thought, when they first began to know her, that the strain of knowing might very well break her. At times, Zoe had sunk into deep preoccupation, and sometimes, when he caught her eyes in those moments, she had the gaze of someone who was nearing the end of their rope. But now, but now there was little of that look to her. Weariness and the long miles of travel there was, but a wall seemed to have slowly formed over her once too expressive features. She spoke more slowly, her thoughts more distant than they had before. So he wondered, was the knowledge she carried slowly beating her down, or was it, instead, only making her stronger? He remembered her words, had seen an ocean of feelings in her eyes when they had argued the previous night. At the time, he had not really thought about it, but now he recalled it, and he wondered at her. She had told him he was supposed to die. Zoe had carried that knowledge from the second she landed in this world, had known it as she spoke to him and dueled with him, but she had never spoken of it. She had carried it from one corner of the land to another until the very moment when she had chosen to act. She could have decided not to. She could have decided that long ago and known it all along as she spent time in his company. No, thought the man as he urged his horse forward. He worried for her and for her strength. He worried that she would not be able to continue and that the weight of the unspoken secret she held would shatter her. Brahm had come to care for the young woman and hoped that she would find her way through the world, whatever world she found herself in. There was little talk as the four riders made their way through the sandstone formations and desert plants. Murtagh and Eragon spoke a little, but mostly silence reigned, for no one was quite sure what to talk about. They knew each other, but they had yet to accept what they knew or let go of things they had once took for truth. Saphira flew above them, too high to be seen, but close enough to help them if they were attacked. It comforted Brahm to have her so close, and he was relieved when they saw no other travelers. This country was inhospitable and little traveled, but the fewer people they saw the better. And as they rode, Brahm watched his companions and he wondered. He watched Murtagh because he did not trust him, and because, as hard as he tried not to, he could not help but see Selina in the young man's eyes. He watched Aragon because, in the end, he was a father and the rider was his son, even if it was a relationship the man had never fully accepted. He watched Zoe and hoped, because he could not grasp the magnitude of her situation, that she could keep herself grounded. He hoped because, inside, he somehow knew that they needed her and she needed them. He had once been told that what did not kill you only made you stronger. But he hoped, for he cared for the girl, that she would not become hard because of this burden. That, somehow, she would retain her light laugh, her ability to smile at a brilliant sunset, and that she would not become a statue that was unable to feel or think beyond the duty they had been set by the world. Later, as he sat by their small campfire, the man found himself watching Selina's two sons duel each other as Zoe cheered them on. As the oldest person there, he found himself laughing inwardly at the sight of the two young men dueling fiercely as a young, beautiful woman watched them. There was an aspect to this duel that was definitely meant to impress, and it reminded Brahm of his own forays into young romance when he was still a rider with a blue sword at his side. It reminded him of Selina and his own Sapphira, but the memories did not hurt that night. And above them, spinning in the sky, were the ever-watchful stars, and around them, flowing by unnoticed, was time, revised on 1/10/2014 in joy. 11, Chapter 13. Wow, almost halfway through this part of the story. As always, thank you to everyone who has reviewed, read, and liked this story. Please read and review. Note asterisk. I do not own Aragon or any characters from the inheritance cycle. The days rolled by unnoticed as our small group traveled in isolation. Aragon was pleased to discover that both he and Murtagh shared many of the same interests and opinions. The two of them spent many hours debating everything from types of swords and fighting techniques to battle strategies. Brahm would often join in, adding his knowledge and experience to the discussions, while I would roll her eyes when the three began to emphasize their points with large gestures. Sapphira and I both found it rather amusing and would laugh with each other when the discussions became particularly fierce. There was one subject, however, that we all avoided discussing by unspoken consent: the past. Aragon and Murtagh were growing closer, and while the group could ride in comfortable silence for hours, there were certain wounds that went too deep, and I did not think it was right that I be the one to bring it all up again. The first week went by without any sign of the Razak, which allayed some of the everyone's fears. Of course, meeting Urgles on this trip was not something I was worried about, but more than once I had to reassure everyone that it was unlikely that we would meet any Urgles on the way to Gilead. Finally, I decided to explain the logic behind it. We had just set out, and all of us were riding abreast through the empty plains. Galbatorix will have the Urgles close to the Haderach, because it is easier for him to use them in a campaign against the Varden. Durza, who controls the Urgles, will be preparing them for an attack in which Galbatorix hopes to destroy the Varden once and for all. Brahm was shocked. How does Galbatorix even know where the Varden are? Before I could answer, Murtagh spoke. What I want to know, said Murtagh, is how the king is controlling the Urgles. How does he keep them from fighting each other or convince them to fight for him? I steered Mellinger around a clump of shrubs as I considered my answer. Do you remember the two magicians that work with the Varden Brahm, the twins? The old storyteller nodded and scowled briefly as he remembered the bald-headed magicians. I ignored it and continued. They have betrayed the Varden and have informed the king not only of the merchants allied with them, but of the Varden's location. I raised a hand to stop Brahm from speaking and said, that is how Galbatorix knew about Jowd and the help he has given the Varden. As for your questions, Murtagh, the answers are quite straightforward. The Urgles are desperate for land in which they can live in safety. They do not want to be hunted to extinction, and with more humans encroaching on their territories, they are becoming more and more concerned about it. Galbatorix has promised them that, and more in exchange for their alliance. To prevent them from fighting each other or turning on him, he has had the Shade, Durza, cast a spell that controls them. If Durza was killed, the spell would break, and the Urgles would be free. Durza! Exclaimed Murtagh. His face darkened as if remembering the Shade and all the unpleasant memories he might have about him. "There is a shade?" asked Brahm, sounding horrified. His eyes were wide, and he unconsciously gripped his sword as he considered all the possibilities of having a shade searching for them. I nodded and said, "Yes, it is because of Durza that you ended up with Saphira's egg Aragon." I glanced at the rider, who looked surprised. The egg's courier, Arya, daughter of Queen Islanzardi, was traveling with her guards when she fell into Durza's trap. The twins had told Durza when and where to find Arya. Durza planned his ambush well and succeeded in killing Arya's two guards. In desperation, she sent the egg to you, Brahm, but it ended up in front of Aragon, who was hunting in the spine. Durza took Arya captive, and she is now in Gilead. So that's how I ended up with Saphira. Is that why you want us to travel towards Gilead? So that we can rescue Arya? Also, is that the woman I've been dreaming of? Aragon had told me. I, of course, already knew of his dreams, and he looked eager. I rolled my eyes. He would be such a love-sick puppy when he met Arya. I really would have to change that. Making a fool of himself with her really didn't earn him any brownie points. I gave a long, suffering sigh and said, "Yes, she is the one you have dreaming of. However, we are not traveling towards Gilead just because of her, though she is a big part of it. If Arya is not rescued soon, then she will be sent to Galbatorix, who will break her mind and steal the location of the elven cities, as well as a great deal of information about the Varden. Also, if Arya is not rescued, then her mother, the Queen, will continue to refuse to give aid to the Varden, who desperately need it. One of the many problems with rescuing her is that none of us are strong enough to fight a shade." "Arjid," said Brahm sternly, "none of you are to take on Durza alone, or even together. You would be slaughtered." We all nodded, though Aragon looked as if he was reluctant to admit that he was not strong enough. With that, we began to speak of other things, though Aragon did not speak much, and his face remained lost in thought. I felt like a good spar. We had just set up camp, and I felt as if I had way too much energy and not enough to do. Riding at a leisurely pace was all fine and good, but I needed an outlet for all my energy. Ergyan and Murtagh had sparred against each other the last few nights while Brahm and I had watched. It was my turn to have a little fun. So instead of sitting down and allowing the two boys to have at it, I drew my sword and said with a smile, "Who wants to spar?" Both Aragon and Murtagh exchanged a wary look before Murtagh drew his sword, and we both passed the blades to Aragon, who blocked the edges before retreating to sit by Brahm. I did wonder sometimes if Aragon had fully grasped that both his half-brother and father were there. Sometimes that boy could be extremely thick-headed. Both Murtagh and I squared off. I quickly reviewed what I knew about Murtagh, and I came to conclusion that the only way to win was to use my speed. Murtagh was strong, but not as fast as I was. With that in mind, I lunged forward, forcing Murtagh to go on the defense, while I quickly followed up with a quick succession of blows. We dueled back and forth, matching each other blow for blow. Finally, I managed to slip my blade around the hilt of Murtagh's, and with a flick I disarmed him. Both of us were panting, though Murtagh was far more tired than I was. I had begun to notice that I had more endurance when compared to others. When he had got his breath back, Murtagh said, "I don't envy the man that challenges you to a duel, Zoe." I shrugged and said with a smile, "You're very good, Murtagh." I turned and gestured at Aragon and said, "Now, Aragon, it's your turn." Murtagh smirked at Aragon and took a seat by Brahm while Aragon prepared his sword. I was looking forward to this duel, if only because I wanted to see how much Aragon had changed. I couldn't help but grin as I saw how nervous Aragon was. Our duel was as long as my one with Murtagh, for Aragon had truly become a master of the blade. However, my speed again gave me the advantage, and I disarmed Aragon in much the same way I had disarmed Murtagh. Despite my wins, I felt out of shape, and it was no wonder. I had really duelled since the slavers, and that had been at least 3 weeks ago. With that, it became routine for Murtagh, Aragon, me, and occasionally Brahm to have mock fights. We forced each other to new heights when we duelled, and often retired for the night with bruises and small scrapes. Fighting multiple opponents was especially good practice for Aragon, Murtagh, and I, who all had limited experience fighting that way. The dueling kept the three of us fit like a set of matched blades. We passed many towns and small cities on our journey, and I had to remind Aragon that Arya was in Gilead. He wanted to search each and every jail just in case. As it was, we all had to devise disguises, as we saw more and more people. There were even notices featuring both Brahm and Iragan. They offered a substantial reward for their capture. Though, as I pointed out to Iragan as we looked at one of the posters, none of them had a very accurate picture or description of him. Iragan had grown up quite a bit, and his face was no longer the teenager one that the Empire had of him. Our travels north forced us closer to the capital, Yereban. It was a heavily populated area, which made it difficult to escape notice. Soldiers patrolled the roads and guarded the bridges. It took us several tense, irritable days to skirt the capital. Once we were safely past Ain, we found ourselves on the edge of a vast plain. It was the same one that we had crossed on our way to Term, except we were on the opposite side. Not that it looked any different or felt any different either. We kept to the perimeter and continued north, following the Ram River. I remembered Iragan's birthday, and despite his protest, I sung him Happy Birthday. I had even gotten him a birthday present in the last town we had passed through. It was a small throwing dagger that could easily be hidden up a sleeve or in a boot. For as I pointed out to the Iragan, 16 was quite an important birthday, and it was worth celebrating it despite the fact we were in the middle of nowhere. At nearly 6 months of age, Saphira was much larger. Her wings were massive. Every inch of them was needed to lift her muscular body and thick bones off the ground. The fangs that jutted from her jaw were nearly as thick around as my fist, and their points were deadly sharp. Along with traveling, sparring, and hunting, there were Brahm's lessons. Iragan practiced more advanced and complex spells, as well as improved his knowledge of the ancient language. I had fallen behind him during my absence, so Brahm gave Murtagh and I separate lessons, while Iragan flew with Saphira or practiced magic. Brahm also continued with his history lessons, and Murtagh even began to talk about court life. I even managed to get him to teach me a few of the dances that were common in the Empire. My memories of home began to fade, despite my best efforts. I still remembered all that was to happen, but I was losing what I had had before. Despite that, it was, as I reflected one night, one of the happiest times in my life. However, like all good things, it had to come to an end, and the closer we got to Gilead, the less time I had before the next major event occurred. Arya. How exactly was I going to bust an elf princess out of jail without being killed by Durza? We stopped on the outskirts of Gilead. Our horses stood side by side as we surveyed the city below. It had taken us nearly a month to reach it, during which time spring had finally nudged away the remnants of winter. During that time, I had watched both Iragan and Murtagh grow and change. Urgyan was stronger and calmer as well as less impatient. Murtagh was more relaxed, and the cloud of anger around him had slowly faded away. From a distance, we could see the city was a rough, barbaric place, filled with log houses and yapping dogs. Lovely. The air was hazy with blue smoke. Wonderful air pollution. The place seemed more like a temporary trading post than a permanent city. 5 miles behind it was the hazy outline of Eisenstar Lake. We chose to camp 2 miles from the city for safety. While our dinner simmered, Murtagh said, "I'm not sure either Brahm or Iragan should be the one to go into Gilead." "Why? Both Brahm and I can disguise ourselves well enough," said Iragan. "Yes," I said, "but the Empire wants you two a great deal more than they want Murtagh. They don't know about me yet either. If one of us were captured, we could escape, but you would taken right to the king." "What are you suggesting then?" said Brahm. I bit my lip and exchanged a look with Murtagh before saying, "I want to visit the city and get an idea for what the layout is and where Arya is being kept. Only then would I feel confident enough to propose a plan to get her out." "Then," said Brahm, "you should either tonight or early tomorrow and return as quickly as possible so that we are not discovered." Iragan opened his mouth to protest, but Saphira spoke. "If anyone is to risk capture, it should be one of them because they would live through it. I do not like it, but it makes sense." "Then let's go," said Murtagh, rising. I nodded and stood beside him. "Shouldn't we rest and wait until tomorrow?" asked Iragan cautiously. "Why, the longer we stay here, the greater the chance that we'll be discovered. There is one thing, though." Murtagh turned and gave me an apologetic look. "I ask that you, Zoe, stay here." I was more than a little insulted. "What? Why? Is it because I'm a girl?" I put my hands on my hips and glared at Murtagh. Saphira chuckled in the background, but I encorned her and the amused look on Brahm's face. Murtagh had the grace to look nervous. No, it's just that the Empire does not know about you. It should stay that way, Zoe. If they find out about what you know, then Galbatorix will fly out and capture you himself. Please, please stay here and let me do this. I sighed, and the more logical part of me agreed with Murtagh, but it hurt to admit he was right. I raised my hands in surrender and said, "Fine, go, but stay safe, Murtagh, or I will come after you." He laughed, and with a wave of his hand, he jumped onto Tornak and rode away. Iragan sat by the fire with Bram while I paced nervously, going over everything I remembered about this part of the story in my head. Hours passed, but Murtagh did not return. Saphira watched, gillied attentively. Only her eyes moved, and no one dared voice their worries, though we did prepare to leave, in case a detachment of soldiers left the city and headed toward their camp. "Look," snapped Saphira. We all whirled to look at the city, alert and watchful. A distant horseman exited the city and rode furiously toward their camp. We waited as he drew closer. As the rider approached, I recognized Murtagh and Tornak. No one seemed to be pursuing him, but he did not slow his reckless pace. He galloped into the camp and jumped to the ground, drawing his sword. "What's wrong?" asked Iragan. Murtagh scowled. "Did anyone follow me from Gilead?" "We didn't see anyone," said Bram. His face was concerned, and I turned to watch the city, just in case something happened. "Good. Then let me eat before I explain. I'm starving." He seized a bowl and began eating with gusto. "After a few sloppy bites," he said through a full mouth, "I found out that the elf is in the main prison. Durza is here, but I did manage to find out that there is a way into the city through the sewers." I nodded and said, "Thank you, Murtagh, but what happened to make you leave like that?" Murtagh shrugged and spooned more food into his bowl before saying, "It's a rather simple thing, but all the more deadly because of it. I was seen in the street by someone who knows me. I did the only thing I could and ran away. It was too late, though. He recognized me." "Oh, no." So it was happening exactly like it should, but when would the ambush be? I couldn't remember now. I ignored the conversation around me and desperately tried to remember, but the information had fled my mind. Not now. Saphira took first watch, but I could not sleep. About 2 hours from dawn, Ergyan rose and the rest of us turned to look at him. It was still and quiet, but Iragan buckled on Zarok as though expecting an attack. No one said anything, but we all prepared for a fight. I could sense the minds of men and horses close as well as Urgel's, so it was happening. We stationed ourselves on either side of Saphira, prepared for an attack. As we waited, the morning star rose in the east. A squirrel chattered. Then an angry snarly from behind made us all whip around. A broad Urgel stood at the edge of the camp, carrying a mattock with a nasty spike. Iragan finished him off with magic, but just then I sensed an Urgel behind me, and I whipped my sword around, killing it with a slash through its heart. More Urgels began to arrive, and we were all quickly engaged in a brutal fight. Somehow I became separated from the others. I was fighting hard, lost in the fight, and the thrill that came from it. I had succeeded in killing at least 4 of the Urgels when I heard Saphira bugle in warning behind me. I turned instantly and saw an Urgel approaching me from behind. I raised my sword, but the Urgel managed to avoid the blade and swung his club. I avoided the worst of the blow, but the end of the club hit me in my right side. I felt my ribs break. The pain hit me then, and with a cry I stumbled, clutching my right side. I managed to get my blade up, and with a wild slash I killed the Urgel, but the world was beginning to spin, and my side was on fire. I felt myself fall, my sword slipping from my hand, and then someone caught me. I was distantly aware of rough voice and the sounds of jingling harness before darkness claimed me. 12, Chapter 14. Didn't think so. Just so you know, it really sucks. Sorry, I'm feeling a bit punchy. Not that I can punch anything in my current state, which is highly unfortunate. I regained consciousness just in time to hear the door to my cell slam shut with a bang. It was followed by the click of tumblers and the soft murmuring of voices. My chest hurt every time I breathed, and the idea of moving, even an inch, sounded like an impossible task. Each time I tried to draw air, another shooting pain would flare through my chest, and I would be left gasping on the little air I had managed to draw in. Someone had cast my limp body down on a thin, lumpy mattress in a cell that would have been an excellent example of what a dark, depressing dungeon should look like. The walls were stone, coated in slime, and splattered in places with what looked like old blood stains or vomit. The only light came from a narrow window with bars on it in the far right corner. A little bit of light streamed inside from it, but it was far from heartwarming and only made the entire situation seem all the more hopeless. Besides my bed, which was made from flat stones with a mattress on top and flat pillow, the only pieces of furniture were a simple wooden chair and a small table upon which someone had left a pitcher and mug. Nothing sharp or even remotely useful if one needed either a way to conveniently exit stage left or plan a daring escape. Drat. Isn't this the moment when all those amazing heroes in books find that magical solution and presto, break themselves out? Isn't this the moment when they're doing something so brave and amazing that we are all left speechless, and after a moment, break out cheering and fall in love with them all over again for being so brave and clever? I can tell you I do not feel brave right now. I do not even feel remotely brave or clever or any of that. You have the wrong story if that is what you are looking for. The door was heavy wood with no keyhole, but there was a small door at the bottom for food to be pushed through and a little window with bars at the top of the door. The hinges were thick and heavy, as if to warn against trying to pry them off. Not that I could move from my bed to the door, and to top it off, I had nothing I could use to pry said hinges off. Life sucks right now, and it started to suck a whole lot more when I began to cough. Each one sent a burst of agony through my body, and was so utterly, gut-wrenchingly painful that I began to cry, which only served to make this worse. When I put my hand to my mouth to try and keep back the coughs, it became splattered with blood. My blood. I groaned and closed my eyes as an overwhelming feeling of nausea gripped me. For what seemed ages, I could do nothing but cough, cry, bite my tongue until it bled, and imagine all the wonderfully terrible things I would do when I got out of this place. But that didn't make me feel any better because, of course, who knows when I will get out of here, if ever. It was easy to think such thoughts when I felt as I did, and my surroundings were as depressing as they were. When the coughs finally passed, I lay on the bed and tried to breathe even as I felt anger slowly growing within myself. It was anger at the world, anger at Durza, anger at the Ugrals, and most of all, anger at myself for being so weak when I needed to be strong. I could still feel the damp tear tracks on my cheeks, and while I tried to wipe them away, I knew they only made me appear more weak and pitiful. I closed my eyes and tried to see a way out of the mess I was in. There was no point lying here feeling helpless and waiting for Durza to march in and start questioning me. I forced myself to slow my breathing and relax my tense muscles. It took minutes, but once I was calmer, I stretched my mind out around me. My last weapon was not my sword or bow, but my mind. Someone, obviously deciding I would be unconscious for a good long while, had left me clear of any mind-numbing drugs. Step 1 to surviving capture: find the little positives. With a little bit of searching, I found the people I was looking for. 3 cells to my right was Iragan, still unconscious, but alive. That gave me a little heart. I had been worried that he could have been killed by the blow to the head he had taken from the Urgles. Once I had assured myself that he was merely out cold and would be for a good while, I continued my search. I passed by the minds of many other prisoners. They were all filled with desperation, hopelessness, and above all else, pain. I skipped past them as fast as I could, for their thoughts were so dark that they were like whirlpools that threatened to pull me in and down my own thoughts in hopelessness. Finally, after a few nerve-wracking moments, I found Arya's mind about 10 down and on the opposite side of the corridor from my own cell. I touched her mind lightly with my own, and from that connection, I saw that the main emotions in Arya's mind were desperate hope for the dragon egg and resignation to her fate. Touching her mind, sensing her pain and grief made me feel like a whining child complaining about a small headache and bruised toe. This noble and self-sacrificing princess knew, quite well, that her chance of escaping before she was broken by the Empire was next to impossible. Instead of feeling bitter about it, her last wish was to know the fate of the egg so that she could die without feeling like she had failed the whole of Alagaesia. To see someone as broken and injured as she was filled me both with pity and anger. What was all this for? A mad king who had slaughtered thousands and did not mind doing it again. Step 2 to surviving capture: Anger can be a positive motivational force. I had to force myself back to the problem at hand. Through the mental line I had thrown towards her, I made my presence known to the elf. Aria Esvitkona. The elf reacted swiftly to my mental question and touch, choosing to dismiss me as just a figment of her imagination caused by the pain of her wounds. I sighed mentally and tried again. Aria Esvitkona, will you please answer me? This time Aria seemed to realize that there really was someone trying to contact her, moi of course, and she swiftly retreated behind her formidable mental barriers. Her response to my question came swiftly. Her voice was lyrical, but wary and filled with pain. Who are you? Why are you contacting me? I felt a little nervous. I was talking to Aria. The Aria who was every bit the selfless 11 princess she was in the book. I'll admit it, I felt terribly inadequate when compared to her both in looks and on the inside. That only made my bad mood all the more darker, and I had to fight to keep my voice cool and unemotional. I am a friend of Brahm as well as a fellow prisoner. My name is Zoe. You know Brahm. Arya's voice was shocked, and I sensed her mind beginning to put together different scenarios, all of which involved various traps and Durza. No, no, you blasted, perfect princess, please don't go jumping to conclusions. If I ever wanted to make my vague plan work, I was going to have to prove my worth without doubt. The only way I could think to do that was to put my knowledge of the ancient language to work and hope my accent was not too atrocious. In fact, I know it is atrocious, and I am dead terrified of making some junior grammatical error. But what have you, life sucks. Step 3 to surviving capture. Be prepared to put all kinds of skills to work, including language and digging skills. When I responded, I spoke the language of power. Yes, I do. I traveled with both Brahm and the new rider Iragan. The egg has hatched and the dragon is called Saphira. Arya was silent for a long moment. Her emotions were conflicted, and when she finally responded, her voice was faint, almost impossible to hear. You said you were captured and held prisoner here. What is your plan? Where are Brahm and this rider? How did the egg hatch? Is this Iragan a human? I hated saying the truth of the situation to someone who did not need another huge negative, but I told Arya the truth, and not just half of it. Iragan was captured with me. I felt Arya's despair, and could already sense her mind filling with images of a blue dragon and her rider being turned against the Varden. I continued quickly, trying to stop Arya from being caught in a negative tailspin. Brahm, however, is free along with my other companion. I can explain more fully how Iragan found Saphira and all that happened after that, but it will have to wait until after we escape this prison. I do know that Brahm is aware of the situation, and so is my other companion, Murtagh. Arya's voice was full of incredulous surprise. To my outrage, she was acting as if the idea that we would ever escape, and then be able to have a story time, was the most outrageous thing she had ever heard. In many ways it was, but I was not in the mood to admit it. In fact, I was so angry with her for being so pessimistic that, had I been able to snort dragon fire, I would have in that tiny little cell with its slimy walls. Escape? How can we escape with the shade Durza? Not even Brahm is a match for his magic, and this rider will not yet be strong enough. I sense that you are in pain as well, and I am too weak to even fight one human. In a voice made crackly by my anger, I snapped back. You forget that Brahm is here, and if anyone could find a way of this mess, it is he. I may be injured, but I am strong in other ways. So are you despite your injuries, and Iragan is far from helpless. At any rate, I am not planning on trying to kill Durza, and neither is anybody else involved. We will make it out. I ground out that final line with all the determination, irritation, and bloody frustration that I could summon up. Somewhere, long ago maybe, I had done this kind of thing before and tried to inspire a person lost in despair and pain to fight again. It was a distant memory, but I wondered what I had possibly been doing then to get myself in this sort of situation. Was I magnet for trouble, or did I just surround myself with people who were? I would not be a good candidate for life insurance. When Arya finally responded, she sounded slightly less desperate and more hopeful, maybe even a little insulted by my tone. I will trust you, Zoe, for now. I hold to the hope that Brahm and your friend managed to find a way to rescue us, if only because of Rider Iragan. If we lose him and Saphira to the Empire, then there is no hope for the Varden or anyone else who dares oppose the king. I rolled my eyes mentally, slightly annoyed with the elven princess and her doom and gloom. She had every right to feel that way, but still, it was not helping matters at all. I withdrew from Arya's mind, but not before saying, "Remember du Weldenvarden Arya Svit Kona. You will see it again before the end. Let that thought give you strength." The elf sent me a small tendril of gratitude before severing the connection completely. Step 4 to surviving capture. Do not be afraid to play dirty and sneak into people's minds. With that task accomplished, I began to search for Durza and the man in charge of the poisons for the prisoners. I managed to find the latter quite easily in a room besides the armory. He was busy mixing up all his nasty little antidotes and poisons with something can only be called glee. It disgusted me. From him, I learned that the antidote for Arya was kept in a box labeled with her cell number. It was mixed anew every night and was then administered to the elf in the morning before her torture session with Durza. After storing the information carefully in my brain, I began to actively search for the shade. It was not hard to find him. In fact, it was so terrifyingly easy that it sent chills through me and made me remember that my captor was not only as evil as they got, but far too close for comfort. The shade's thoughts were a writhing mass of voices whispering dark and evil things that sent shivers through me. Durza was located on the upper level of the stone building that served both as a prison and as a control center for the army posted in Gilead. It was to this fortress-like place that all the missives, orders, meetings, and supplies for Galbatorix's most concentrated group of soldiers went through. The Shade was speaking to the captain who had led the raid, in which they had captured the dragon rider, and a girl, me. I listened more attentively to conversation, as the captain explained that 2 others had escaped with the aid of a blue dragon, and that no sign of them had been found. The little happiness I felt, however, was quickly snuffed out when Durza commanded to be shown to our cells. Yippee! I waited in desperate silence as Durza first visited Iragan's cell. Please, I thought, please stay unconscious, Iragan. I watched through Durza as the Shade administered a drug that both effectively removed any magical threat the rider posed and also prevented me from being able to contact Iragan through my mind. Great. That really made things so much more complicated. Congratulations, Durza, you have effectively made this the worst day of my life. Those thoughts, however, were quickly dismissed as the Shade approached my own cell. What was I going to do? The Shade would not hold back in his interrogation of me. He would want to learn as much about me as he possibly could so he would what kind of threat I could be to him, his precious plans, and his king. My only safeguard was my unusually strong mental barriers and the very simple fact of, I am a girl. When you are a girl, there are times in your life when you should shamelessly play the weaker sex card. I decided to try and pretend to be unconscious. It may not work, but it might give me a little time before I had to face the Shade head-on. I forced myself to relax, and with my eyes closed, I had to rely on my other senses. There was the sound of soft footsteps, the sound of a lock turning, and then the door opening. I slowed my breathing even more and listened to the soft footsteps of Durza as he approached my bed, the creak of the chair as the Shade sat down, and then his cold fingers at my wrist as he checked for a pulse. I forced myself to stay relaxed as the hand moved from my wrist my broken ribs. Durza paused and lightly pressed his fingers to the bones. I tried. I really tried to stay perfectly quiet and still, but I couldn't. I am, it has been proven this day, nothing more than a coward who can't keep her mouth shut to save her life. How funny to think that, just a few meters away and through an iron-barred window, is freedom. How hard to think that I could not fly away through the narrow opening and be free of this place. But I could not. I was grounded and facing a creature that was in complete control of me, could do whatever he liked to me, and it was completely and utterly humbling even as it terrified the living daylights out of me. Suddenly, I had my back against a wall, and I could not fight my way out of it with any weapon I was used to having at my disposal. All I had was my wits, my words, and my doe eyes. The small pressure was enough to make me groan in pain. From the Shade's mind, I saw his amusement as he realized that I was awake. My fear continued to grow as I heard just a few of the tortures the spirits were telling Durza to use. In the face of those horrible things, I felt my insides shrivel and weaken with terror. How had Arya done this? How had all those people who had been captured and tortured that one read about in novels done this? I knew one thing. I would lie. I would lie through my teeth. I would do whatever it took to keep myself in one piece. Wake up, little girl. He had a beautiful voice. Smooth and soft, it was as dangerous as a beautiful snake gliding through tall grass. Almost against my will, I opened my eyes and looked up into the hard, cold eyes of the shade. But I had no choice, and I hated it. I hated my weakness, my fear, and my inability to act even a quarter as bravely as Arya had. He smirked it down at me and said in his silky voice, "What a troublemaker you have been, pretty one, killing my Urgles and helping those two criminals escape." He might as well have shook a finger at me like a disproving math teacher. I said nothing, just glared right on back. This seemed to only amuse the shade more, and he continued with a faint smirk. "I didn't believe it at first when I heard about you from my captain. How, I asked myself, could a young, beautiful little lady traveling with a group of men, undisguised, without a suitable escort or any protection against the dangers of the wild? It was unthinkable as well as cruel and unjust. I said nothing, unwilling to give the shade anything that he could twist around and use to harm me or Aragon. So answer me, my lady, why are you so far from home? From my examination of Durza's thoughts, I saw that he was both curious to learn not only where I was from, but also what kind of threat I could pose to him. He believed I was the runaway daughter of some noble lord, and once I realized the game was up and confessed, he would be able to send me home and collect some sort of reward from both my father and the king. He was certain that it would take very little pressure from him before I would give him the answers he expected, probably with floods of tears and wails, but answers nonetheless. Unfortunately, he was probably right, and here is the sad thing. I was more than to play at being the Osa rebellious daughter card, then well I bloody well would before he got started with my fingers, my toes, and other parts of my body that no one should do such things to. I did not want my body, my very self, violated in such ways. I am here because your men and Urgles, I spat the word with all the venom I could muster, who all serve under you whether by magic or by Galbatorix's orders brought me. I did not choose to be here. Why would I control the Urgles? They are monsters, and the Along would never consider an alliance with creatures that massacre entire villages and towns. Oh, how smooth you are, Durza, turning the tables on me with such complete ease. Too bad for you that I could watch your thoughts. You were shocked and unnerved by my words. You may act like you would have it under control, but you are quickly re-evaluating your opinion of me. Even your silky voice had become softer and more deadly. But I knew my power lay in my seeming uselessness, my clear terror, and my wide, childlike eyes. A little bit of common sense told me that telling Durza of my power with minds could really backfire, but it would also buy me some time. I was desperate to regain some power, because after all, I was lying on a bed, and he was leaning over me. I was nothing, a little fly he was all too willing to stamp under a boot. I smirked slightly, enjoying the little bit of power I did have over the shade. You control the Urgles, because the king is going to use them to destroy the Varden. You are their commander, and you use your magical abilities to keep them under control and loyal to your core. I know this because I am currently inside your mind, and I have been since I arrived here. Silence fell for a long moment as the shade looked down at me. From his mind, I could sense his surprise, suspicion, and curiosity. He had decided I might be useful to the king after all, and even if I wasn't, it wouldn't be hard to get rid of me one way or the other. So Durza played my game and said, "Prove it. Tell me what I am currently thinking." The shade bared his teeth in a gruesome imitation of a smile. I focused on his thoughts more intently and said, "You are thinking the same things that the spirits inside of your mind are. They are saying things that I would rather not repeat loud." It was true. Even a few seconds inside the shade's mind made me feel hopeless and frightened for more than just my life and my companions, but for the whole of this world. Those spirits didn't want their host to settle for anything less than covering this land in war, pain, and darkness. The shade looked down at me in shocked surprise before laughing. The sound was cold and chill. I shivered and wished I was anywhere but there. "You are a clever little girl, aren't you? Able to enter a guarded mind without challenge or notice is quite a skill. I hope you decide to use it to benefit the king. If not, then we might have a little discussion about where your allegiance belongs. I didn't even want to know what that discussion would entail. In fact, I did know, and I didn't want to think about it. I desperately wanted to score a point against the shade, prove to him that I was not some simple little girl that was easy to control. In a cold voice, I said, "It's quite amazing, really, that Galbatorix would choose to put you in command of his armies. How you even form coherent sentences with all those voices in your head is quite astonishing." The shade glared down at me and said in an even softer but far more dangerous tone, "Careful, little girl, it would be a shame to have to break you now just when you start becoming interesting. Now tell me why you were traveling with the rider. Tell me everything you know of their plans, and I will treat you kindly." It was time to leave the defiance behind. It was time to leave pride at the door and resign myself that in the end, sometimes the cowards live longer. I needed pitiful and weak. They never tell me anything. I just know that they were planning on continuing away from the Empire after purchasing supplies. Even my voice was softer and milder, as if I really was submitting to the Shade's will. Durza raised an eyebrow and dropped his hand to my chest, where he pushed on my broken bones. Stars flickered in front of my eyes as I gasped in pain, my breath leaving me and stabbing knives, making it hard to pull any air back in. "Tell me the truth, little girl, or I will hurt you far more. There are worse injuries than broken ribs." Guess he hadn't fallen for it. Drat. "I'm telling you the truth. I was just tagging along, and they never trusted me with any information about the Varden or their plans. Please believe me." Durza removed the pressure from my ribs, and I lay there gasping like a pathetic fish. From Durza's mind, I could see that he was pleased by my answer. I would be easy to control until he could hand me over to the king, and he did not think I had any information worth his while anyways. After all, who would bother telling a girl? In many ways he was right. I was weak, and so stupid to have thought I could outwit someone as cruel and twisted as he was. What a horrible little coward I was when pinned up next to Arya. It made me angry, and anger was what made the fear recede a little. Leaning back in his chair, Durza said coolly, "We will see about that, little girl. However, I have other more urgent matters to attend to. Until I can make time for another little chat, I want to make sure that you receive sufficient rest." I watched the shade warily as he removed a vial of some clear liquid from his robes. Durza uncorked the bottle and said, "This should keep you from doing anything stupid, little girl." Before I could do anything or try and move, the shade gripped my chin and forced the vial of liquid into my mouth. The liquid burned my throat on the way down, and it worked quickly. I felt myself fall, and the last thing I heard was Durza saying with barely contained amusement, "Sweet dreams." Despair filled me, and I slipped away into another part of myself, unable to fight the effects of the drug. Did I mention that being captured sucks? Thank you for reading. Hope you enjoyed. Message to Book Lover 19. I'm not sure if you have a PM account, otherwise this would be a private message. If you have one, or would like to make one, then maybe PM me, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. 13. Rescue. Thank you to all the amazing people who reviewed after my last update. I hope that this chapter measures up, and that if you do have any suggestions for future plot developments, that you let me know. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking rapidly as I tried to focus on the dark stone ceiling. My body felt heavy and unresponsive. It was difficult to even summon enough energy to turn my head so I could at the door to my cell. The slimy, dark stone of the cell made me feel slightly claustrophobic, and I absently wondered if they would collapse and bury me alive. No sunlight came through the window, so I assumed that it must be night. Not that I really cared about that either. I had been lying there for who knows how long when the distant sounds of heavy boots on stone and men's voices floated through the stone and thick wooden door. I was beginning to come out of the drug haze, at least enough that I was curious about the sounds. It occurred to me that they might be from Iragan's own little escape, but there was no way I could get to the door to confirm that idea, so I just lay there and listened. I was unable to use my mental powers because of the drug, but once it wore off, I could do something. I needed a strategy. I could not wait any longer for Brahm or Murtagh. It was getting too dangerous, and soon Durza would take us to Galbatorix. Even thinking about that made my blood run cold. I vaguely remembered my father telling me in a vastly superior voice, "Fortune favors the brave." The sounds outside my door were really starting to sound suspiciously like fighting. The clatter of steel on steel, and was that the sound of a body hitting the floor? Had Brahm and Murtagh actually managed to find a way into this prison to rescue us? My heart leaped, and I felt a small balloon of hope grow inside me. Please let it be them, I wished desperately. Or maybe they had already gotten Iragan and Arya out, but been unable to rescue me. The very idea filled me with panic, and it took all my self-discipline to rein it back in. They would never leave me behind. Ever. I knew that as well as I knew my own name. My wish and desperate hopes were granted just a few seconds later when the door to my cell burst open. Silhouetted against the torchlight was a dark, tall figure. He was dressed as an Empire Solider, but his face was obscured by the hood of a thick, black cloak. It was not until I saw the familiar hand-and-a-half sword swinging at his hip that I realized that the man was in fact Murtagh. I don't know if I can quite put into words how it felt to see him again. I was both relieved to see him, glad that things were sort of going according to the book, but also terrified that Durza would show up and capture not only Murtagh, but Brahm. I felt tears beginning to prick my eyes, and my nose began to itch like it always did when I was about to cry. It was all just too much. First my injury, then Durza, and then this. I didn't care that I was acting like a little girl, and not the hardened fighter I had tried to act like. No longer did the fates of all those who fought against Galbatorix hang on whether or not I was clever enough to get myself, Iragan and Arya, out of this prison aid and free. I could share that burden now, and if I had my way I would never again return to this place. Ever. Murtagh hurried forward, his bow was still drawn, and I could see the bodies of dead soldiers just outside, but none of that mattered right then. When Murtagh reached the side of the bed, he knelt down and gently brushed a lock of stray hair from my forehead. The gesture conveyed both his relief to find me alive and relatively unharmed. In a soft voice he asked, "Are you injured, Zoe?" I nodded my head. "I have some broken ribs, and Durza gave me a drug that is only now beginning to wear off." Murtagh set his jaw. I saw a spark of anger in his eyes, but when he spoke his voice was still gentle. "Then I'll have to carry you." I suddenly remembered that I had to tell him about Arya. How could I have forgotten? I silently betrayed myself for almost forgetting something so crucial. "Murtagh," I said urgently, "the antidote for Arya is in the room beside the armory in a glass vial labeled with her cell number. You cannot forget, please." Murtagh nodded, understanding instantly. In the same gentle tone he said, "I promise. Now let's go." He slipped his arms underneath me and lifted me as gently as he could. It still hurt like mad, and I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out, but I managed to keep myself under control. Murtagh carried me back into the corridor lined with cells. The only lint came from the torches that hung every few feet. They gave off just enough light to see the bodies of 6 Empire soldiers. I could not help but wonder if they had families who lived in the city. What would the impact of the deaths of these 6 men be on the people who loved them? I was distracted from my dark, depressed thoughts when Brahm appeared from a cell carrying an unconscious Arya. Ragan was beside him, talking urgently. A dark bruise was still evident on his forehead, and his clothes were stained with Urgal blood. They both looked up, and I saw expressions of relief and concern flash across their faces before Murtagh spoke. "We need to go." "Yes," said Brahm. He was also dressed as a guard, and it looked like he had used magic to alter his appearance. His hair was darker, with no streaks of grey, and the lines on his face had been removed or lessened, as if to suggest early middle age. It was very strange to see his distinctive face so altered. Then again, better a younger Brahm than one captured by the Empire, because they recognized him. Without another word, we made our down the hallway and then up a stone-hewn staircase. I knew that Murtagh was being as careful with me as he could, but any movement or slight stumble hurt. Broken ribs really were a pain, as were the lingering effects of the drug. My thoughts still felt slow, and my head ached dully. As we climbed, Iragan asked, "How are we going to get out without being noticed?" I could not help but roll my eyes at the question. Captain Obvious strikes again. "We're not," grunted Murtagh. "We have distraction planned," said Brahm in a forcibly positive tone. It was similar to the one my running coach had used at practice, falsely peppy and cherry. It should work. Now be as quiet as you can, all of you. At the head of the stairs was banquet room filled with broad wooden tables. Shields lined the walls, and the wood ceiling was trussed with curved beams. Brahm set Arya down gently on one of the heavy wooden tables. Murtagh set me down on one of benches. I leaned my back against the edge of the table and tried to slow my breathing. "Now," said Brahm, looking worried, "can you tell Saphira to wait another 5 minutes?" Iragan nodded and conveyed the message. He knew better than to question either Brahm or Murtagh about their plan. I didn't have the strength. There were shouts in the distance. Soldiers marched past the entrance to the room, and I shivered. Durza would be here soon. Brahm turned and looked at Murtagh. They seemed to have a hidden conversation because Brahm said simply, "Go." Murtagh nodded and took off running. What was going on? Was Murtagh going to find our weapons and the antidote, or was this just another part of the plan? Maybe a distraction on another floor to send everybody running there instead of to the prison cells. Murtagh had not been gone long when the sounds of men coming up the stairs reached us. All of us turned to look at the entrance to the banquet hall in panic. I tried to slip from my seat on the bench and onto the floor, but before I could, Brahm lifted me and put me gently down on the cold stone underneath the table. Iragan placed Arya beside me, and both he and Brahm crouched beside us. My heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud to my ears, as did my breathing. Then again, even the smallest noise when you are trying to hide sounds loud. I was certain that someone would notice our not exactly fantastic hiding place. A group of 10 guards entered the room. They passed through it hurriedly, looking under just a few of the tables, and continued on their way. We waited underneath the table, except for Iragan, who made a mad dash for some food that was left on the table. Finally, I couldn't stand just lying there on the dirty stone floor, so I pushed myself up, inch by inch. It hurt, but unless you've had the pleasure of experiencing broken ribs, then you really can't appreciate just how awful I felt, or how difficult even using your arm to support yourself is. Brahm watched me with concern, but said nothing, and I managed to get myself upright. It was then that an out-of-breath, paled-faced Murtagh returned. He was carrying Zar, Rak, my own sheathed sword, along with my quiver, bow, and horn. He also had a strange sword and bow that must belong to Arya, for they were graceful, thin, and deadly all at once. Both Iragan and Brahm left our hiding place under the table, and Murtagh passed Iragan his sword. As he did, he said to me, "I'll keep your weapons, Zoe, for now. I found the other sword and bow in the guardroom. I've never seen weapons like them before, so I assumed that they were the elves." "They are," I said. "Did you get the antidote?" Murtagh nodded and patted his chest. "I've got it, but I think we should wait until after we escape to give it to her." I nodded, and Iragan said tensely, "Durza will be here soon. We need to go now." Brahm looked around the room before saying, "Our escape has been arranged. Be patient." It was then that I felt a cold shiver run up and down my spine. I felt like I was about to be attacked. I turned my head and looked towards the far end of the banquet hall. The torches at that end had not been lit, and the shadows were thick, thick enough to hide someone from view. I softly touched Murtagh's hand and whispered so softly that both he, Iragan, and Brahm had to bend closer to hear. "Durza is watching us from the other end of the hall. Be ready." The faces of my companions automatically tightened, and their hands tensed around their weapons. Carefully, they formed a kind of protective circle around the unconscious elf, and I wished I could have been standing beside them with my sword drawn, but I was worse than useless with my ribs the way they were. If Durza was watching us, which I knew without doubt he was, then he would know that we knew of his presence. Any chance of ambushing us was gone, but that did not mean that we had any kind of upper hand. Far from it. All Durza had to do was call for guards, and the game would be over. In a very cold, calm voice, Brahm spoke towards the shadowy end of the hall. "Durza, ready to face me, or do you still want to lurk in shadows like a coward?" His voice, while low, carried through the hall. It sounded strong and determined. I could not help but wonder if challenge, the shade head-on, was the best tactic, but too late to change anything. A cold chuckle filled the banquet room. I shivered as the too familiar drawl of the shade answered Brahm's challenge. "I'm afraid that you aren't done hiding, Brahm." Durza walked out into the torchlight. The shade's face was nightmarish. The flickering light of the torches cast a dark light on it, making it appear almost like a death mask. I wished more than ever I could stick a knife through his twisted heart and free this world from the terror that dares us speed like a black cloud. In the shade's hand was a pale sword with a thin scratch on the blade. He unclasped the brooch at his throat that held his cape in place and let it fall to the ground as he prepared himself to fight. "So, my young rider, do you wish to test yourself against me?" sneered the shade. "Or maybe you wish to, old man, or what of you, pretty one?" The shade smirked at me, and I glared right on back, unwilling to show the shade how frightened I was of him. The drug still prevented me from using my mental powers, or else I would have tried to attack the shade head-on right then. "I'll take care of him," said Murtagh quietly, putting down his bow and drawing his sword. I made to say something, but Aragon beat me to it. However, he did not say, "No way can either you or I do this." Instead, he decided to send himself to the chopping block. "No, he wants me more. He won't kill me, but you two had better have a way out of here." Before anyone could say anything to dissuade him, Aragon walked forward confidently. He unsheathed Zarok as he advanced towards the shade. Aragon looked grimly purposeful, ready for whatever the shade threw at him. He met Durz's unwavering maroon eyes unflinchingly. I had to give him credit for how brave he was acting. I heard Brahm curse quietly, and he glanced up at the ceiling as if urging Saphira to hurry up. I added my own silent plea to his. The shade's quiet, cold laughter filled the room as the two began to circle each other. Both of them held their blades at the ready and stared at each other without blinking. "Don't let him trick you, Aragon," I thought desperately. Durza outmatched Aragon in every single department from magic to swordsmanship. It was then that there was a loud crack from the ceiling followed by a boom and the sounds of screams. Both Durza and Aragon looked upwards, but Durza reacted quicker and took advantage of the rider's distraction to attack. Somehow, I'm still not sure how he did it, Aragon got Zarok up in time to block the attack. The rider and the shade dueled back and forth as the sounds of screeches and the clashing of metal came from above. What exactly was Saphira doing up there? Pieces of rubble began to fall, the ceiling shook. I was grateful for the solid wooden table above my head, for it shielded me from the falling pieces of stone. I turned my attention back to the duel and winced as I saw Aragon narrowly dodge a thrust. With an almost lazy flick of his wrist, Durza sent Zarok spinning out of Aragon's hands. The force of the shade's blow sent Aragon to his knees. I closed my eyes, unable to watch the unfolding scene. Durza said in a contemptuous voice, "A powerful piece you may be in the game that is being played, but I'm disappointed that this is your best. If the other riders were this weak, they must have controlled the Empire through sheer numbers." Ouch! That was a blow not only to Aragon, but to Brahm, who had been raised in that lost age. He had seen the riders in all their glory and strength. To hear that strength and glory insulted would be like ripping a band-aid off a half-healed cut. I opened my eyes and saw Aragon, still kneeling in front of the shade, shake his head and say in a very cold, mocking voice, "No, you forget something." I gasped as I suddenly remembered, just as Durza did. How could I have forgotten her? She was the most important part of this entire game, and nor did she like being forgotten. A thunderous reverberation echoed through the room as a chunk, yes, a chunk, of the ceiling was torn away to reveal the night sky. I had never been so happy to see stars after being locked away in a prison cell. They glimmered far away like a distant promise of freedom. I turned back to see Aragon roll away from shade as shingles fell from the roof above. Durza snarled in rage, swinging his sword viciously. He missed, and just as he prepared to lunge forward, an arrow sprouted from his shoulder. One of Murtagh's arrows, to be precise. This only seemed to amuse the shade, who laughed and snapped the arrow off with 2 fingers. "You'll have to do better than that if you want to stop me." The next arrow, however, did do better than the first one. It caught Durza right between the eyes, and the shade howled in agony. I felt a sense of vindictive pleasure as Durza's skin turned grey and mist formed around him, hiding him from view. There was a shattering cry, then the cloud disappeared. All that was left was a pile of clothes and the blood-red cape. Brahm cursed and whirled around on Murtagh. That was very foolish, boy. He will just come back stronger and with a worse temper. Before anyone could reply, a man from the doorway shouted, "That's it. He failed. Go in and get them." Soldiers with nets and spears poured into the banquet room. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, and I pushed myself up. Brahm grabbed Arya, and we all backed up against the stone wall. It's funny how adrenaline can mask pain. I knew I would pay for this later, but for now I was just happy to be able to move. Murtagh passed me my sword, and I quickly strapped it on, loving the familiar feeling of its weight on my hip. The men formed a menacing half-circle around us. A few of the brave ones even jabbed their spears forward, making us press our backs even harder against the wall. It was then that Saphira came to our rescue. The great azure blue dragon stuck her head through the hole in the ceiling and roared a challenge to the soldiers. With another massive crack, Saphira ripped out more of the ceiling. I glanced up nervously. What if Saphira destroyed too much and the structural supports gave out? It was then that, with a resounding report, the center beam of the ceiling cracked and more shingles fell. Confused and panicked, the men broke ranks as they tried to avoid being hit by one of the heavy slate shingles that were raining down. Saphira roared again, and the soldiers fled, some getting crushed on the way. With a massive heave, Saphira tore off the rest of the ceiling before jumping into the banquet hall with her wings folded. Her weight splintered a table, and the floor shook. Eragon hurried to her side, and I watched as the two partners of heart and soul greeted each other. I saw the flaming rage of battle in Saphira's eyes vanish, and the tension faded from Eragon's face as they talked with each other mind to mind. It was rather beautiful to see the love and trust they had for each other so openly displayed. The rest of us made our way to Saphira. I was still running on pure adrenaline, and I was able to scramble onto Saphira's back with relatively no pain. Oh, this would hurt soon. Dismounting would be especially interesting. Somehow all five of us managed to get ourselves onto Saphira's back. How long we would all stay on her, as both Eragon and Murtagh were sort of hanging off the sides, remained to be seen. The still unconscious Arya was held by Brahm, who sat in front of me. Before Saphira could take off, Brahm said to her, "I will give you as much strength as I can, Saphira. Use the updrafts to get airborne and try to glide as much as possible." Saphira nodded her great blue head in understanding, and then the dragon bunched all her muscles. With a great heave, she leapt out of the banquet hall and onto the fortress's roof, where the bodies of the watchmen lay scattered. "Look," said Murtagh, pointing. I cursed under my breath as I saw a row of archers filing out of a tower on the other side of the roofless hall. I looked to my right and saw that my bow and quiver were in easy reach. Murtagh had slung them across his shoulder, and I quickly grabbed them. With quick, efficient motions, I strung the weapon and fitted an arrow to the string. "Saphira, you have to take off. Now," warned Eragon. Just as Saphira unfurled her massive wings, I turned slightly and took aim at one of the archers on the other side of the building. It was difficult to keep my aim steady, for at that moment, Saphira took a great running leap and propelled us off the edge of the building, but I fired my arrow anyways. I was satisfied to see at least one of the archers stumble and fall as the arrow found its target. Saphira struggled underneath me as she tried to gain enough altitude with the extra weight on her back. Brahm had one hand on her neck, and I noticed that the sapphire ring Aaron was glowing slightly as he transferred energy to her. It was then that an arrow whizzed past us. The archers were returning fire. I fitted another arrow to the string and turned so I could fire it back over my shoulder towards the archers on the wall. I had just fired my fifth arrow when Saphira roared in pain. One of the arrows had struck her in the wing, and she had to roll to the left to avoid the next volley. More arrows perforated the sky, but we were already too far away for them to do any serious damage. I slipped my bow back into its quiver and buckled it across my back. I felt so much better with my weapons again. No longer did I feel like a scared rabbit about to be picked up by a hawk. If I learned nothing else from my time in Gilead, it was that I loved my freedom, and I would do anything to protect it. Never again did I want to feel locked in a cage with no hope and no promise of rescue. I felt the adrenaline beginning to fade as we flew over the city and towards the east. I leaned my head against Brahm as the pain and weariness hit me again. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore the irregular wing beats of Saphira, or the pain, or the soldiers that would be searching for us, or the darkness of my prison cell, or Durza's cold laughter. Instead, I tried to think of how good the wind felt in my hair, how bright the stars were, how it felt to see Murtagh again, and how much I loved the feeling of being surrounded by people who I loved and trusted. 14, Chapter 15. I am so sorry about how long this took, but I was at a horse show for the last 2 weeks and didn't have a computer, just my phone. I really want to hear from you about this chapter because I did a bit of a plot change, and I'm not sure how it's going to work out. So let me know, and I hope you enjoy the latest chapter in this story. Sapphira drifted down to an open, grassy clearing about 15 miles from the outskirts of Gilead. The blue dragon landed on the crest of a hill and rested her outstretched wings on the ground. She was shaking with the effort of carrying all of us and the pain from her arrow wound. Snowfur, Tornak, Melinlas, and Kadok were all picketed on the edge of clearing. Despite being used to Sapphira and her landings, the horses snorted nervously and danced at the end of their tethers. Iragan slipped off Sapphira, and Brahm passed him Arya before climbing down himself. I took a deep breath and sort of fell off Sapphira's side. I stumbled when I touched the ground and would have fallen had Murtagh not steadied me with a firm grip, only elbow. I nodded in thanks, and Murtagh asked gently, "Would you like to sit down?" "No, I'm fine," I lied. My head was spinning and my ribs hurt, but I was tired of being weak and injured. Murtagh frowned, but before he could say anything, I pulled my arm from his grip and walked towards the horses. I was anxious to see my mare again and make sure she had not been injured during the clash with the Urgles and soldiers. When I reached her, I rested my head against her warm neck, enjoying the familiar warmth and smell. Melinlas gave a quiet nicker and gently nuzzled my shoulder. I smiled and said softly, "I missed you." My mare snorted, and I twisted my hands tightly in her black mane, simply glad to be back with my mare, who had been a faithful companion for many miles. Murtagh was standing beside Tornak, quickly readying him and the other the horses for travel, while Iragan quickly checked Sapphira over for injuries. Brahm knelt beside Arya, and I saw the glint of a glass vial in his hand. He must just have given her antidote to the poison. It was then that Iragan called Murtagh over, and I watched as both he and Iragan prepared to remove the arrow that was deeply embedded in Sapphira's wing. The sudden pain from the removal of the arrow caused Sapphira to jerk her wing wildly. The sudden movement clipped Murtagh in the chin, knocking him to the ground. With a growl, Sapphira shook the tree she had been holding in her mouth, spraying everyone within 10 feet with dirt before throwing it away. Murtagh rubbed his bruised chin before returning to the horses. "Are you all right?" I asked. Murtagh shrugged and said, "Yes, she just caught me by surprise." I nodded and turned to check Melinlas's girth, but before I could prepare to mount, I felt a firm hand grip my shoulder. I turned and came face to face with Brahm. His face had returned to normal, and he was smiling kindly at me. I groaned inwardly. I knew what was coming. "You cannot ride with us, Zoe. Until I have a chance to examine your injuries, you should ride Sapphira." His voice, while gentle, was firm and unyielding. I sighed in annoyance, but I knew that Brahm was right. I could not ride at the pace we needed to with my ribs and the after effects of the drug. I glanced over at my other two companions and saw identical expressions of relief and worry. A little bit of annoyance rose inside of me. Did they think I would be so selfish as to argue with them right now about whether or not I could ride my mare? I made my way over to Sapphira, who was waiting for me with Arya, who was still unconscious but already strapped to the saddle. Sapphira and Iragan spoke privately for a minute before the azure dragon turned her head to look at me. I smiled and rested my hand on her warm side, sending a greeting to her through my mind. Sapphira responded to my greeting with one of her own. Her deep voice was gentle, and it rumbled through my mind like thunder. "I am glad to have you back, Zoe. I missed you. I missed you to Sapphira. You have no idea how happy I am to back with all of you." The dragon nodded her head, and I scrambled up into the saddle. Arya was in front of me, and I quickly strapped my legs into the saddle. Once I was ready, Sapphira shook her wings and prepared to take off. Do you know the feeling of a jet taking off? The bumps, and then the sudden gain in altitude as the ground drops away and you are surrounded by nothing but air. That is how it feels when a dragon takes off, only it isn't as smooth, and there is no flight attendant telling you how to get out of the aircraft in an emergency. I bent my head as the wind whistled past me. It made my eyes water, and I drew my cloak tighter to try and guard against the chill. Iragan, Murtagh, and Brahm were lost in the shadows within a few seconds, and when I looked back towards Gilead, I saw the lights of search parties. The Empire was wasting no time in trying to find us. Soon they would have our trail, and it would take everything we had to stay ahead of them, but I was too tired to worry about it. I rested my head on Arya's back and closed my eyes. I was asleep within seconds. I had to be dreaming. I knew I was, but it felt so real, so undeniably real. I was standing in the middle of a bright, high-ceilinged room. My ribs no longer hurt, and neither did I feel light-headed or dizzy, but rather as if I had just had a refreshing night's sleep. I still wore my blood-stained, dirty clothing, and my weapons were still with me. I felt terribly out of place in the immaculate white marble room. In the center of the hall was a raised dais on which stood two golden thrones, and beside them were four smaller thrones, two on each side of the larger ones. The thrones were empty, but the sound of echoing footsteps made me turn and look behind me. At the far end of the hall were two great golden doors carved with scenes of battles and landscapes. They were very beautiful, and I instinctively knew that I would not be able to open them, but that was not what held my attention for long. Walking towards me was a man. No, not a man, but a teenager. He was handsome, about my age, maybe a year or two older, and he walked with a kind of purposeful determination that spoke of inner confidence. His hair was a similar color to my own, and so were his eyes. He wore black clothes, similar to my own, and his weapons, I noticed with surprise, were of similar design as mine. Whoever he was, he looked like a leader, someone who trusted themselves and their judgment without question. The kind of person you could always trust and rely on in a sticky situation. A name rose unbidden to my lips, and I said softly, almost not really knowing why I said it, Earmund. Memories danced on the edges of my thoughts, almost within reach but not quite. A smile broke out across his face. When he smiled, the serious, almost sad look left his face, and his dark eyes shone with light and joy. I could not help but smile back, and in 3 steps Earmund was in front of me. He was a good 3 or 4 inches taller than me, and as I looked up into his face, I had that disconcerting feeling of knowing someone but not really remembering how or where we had met. The feeling one gets when someone who remembers you says, hello, and you can't, for the life of you, remember who they are or how you met them. Earmund raised one hand to my face, gently cupping my cheek with his hand, as if he wanted to reassure himself that it really was me and I wasn't going to disappear like a mirage. His hand was roughed and calloused from fighting, but it was also warm and comforting. We stood silent looking at each other for a few minutes until Earmund said softly, I've missed you, Zoe. His voice was strained as if he was struggling to keep his composure in front of me. I did not know what to say. What do you say when faced with that kind of situation? The logical part of me told me that I should ask not only who Earmund was, but where I was. The room felt real enough, but that did not mean it was. Was this a dream, or was it a memory? Maybe Earmund wasn't a real person, just a figment of my imagination caused by exhaustion or the lingering effects of the drug. I opened my mouth to speak, but Earmund cut me off. His voice was urgent, as if he had very little time and a great deal to tell me. I know you have many questions, and I want to answer them for you, but there is no time for that. Not now, at least. We will speak again soon, but until then you must return to Alagaesia. Before you can, however, you must know something. Here he paused and seemed to steel himself, as if what he was about to tell me was very difficult for him. Earmund continued on, though slower this time, and his eyes never left mine. When you were in prison, Durza didn't just give you a drug. After his visit to you, he returned a little while later and gave you a rare and deadly poison, the same poison that he gave to Arya. I was shocked, horrified more like it. I managed to find my voice, though it came out higher than usual. You mean that Durza gave me Skilna Brog? My mind raced through all the consequences. There was no antidote close at hand, and the antidote I had told Murtagh to get had already been used on Arya. I was dead. I would never get home, never see my family, and never know the truth about my past. Officially and completely dead. Earmund nodded, and I saw that he was more than worried for me. He was terrified. How well did he know me? He acted like he was my older brother, and I was his darling younger sister. However, I had bigger problems than wondering about what Earmund's relationship was with me. Yes, now listen carefully, Zoe. I raised my eyebrows. Listen carefully. What did he think I was doing? Eamund continued, ignoring me. The only way to slow the poison is to go into a deep, dreamless state. You are lucky because Durza did not give you the full dosage. He gave you enough that if you did escape, you would still die, but within a couple of days, not hours. My head was spinning with all this information. Just a second. How can I go into a deep, dreamless state that only elves are supposed to be able to go to? And exactly where am I? What is going on? Eamund bit his lower lip and said, "There isn't time to explain everything, Zoe. However, aren't you beginning to realize that you are more than some human girl? You aren't an elf, but neither are you just an ordinary human. Once you leave here, you can either choose to go into a dreamless state or awaken. However, the more time you spend awake, the faster the poison will act. You have to slow the effects, or else your companions will not be able to help you." I was about to ask for more details. In fact, I was ready to demand more, but before I could, the room began to fade like dreams do when you are about to awaken. Eamund raised his eyes to look at ceiling, and then he dropped his hand to my shoulder, which he squeezed tightly. "You must go," Eamund said. "I promise we will see each other soon, Zoe. Very soon, and then I will be able to explain more, but for now we must part. Fare thee well, and please don't lose hope." I opened my mouth to speak, but I did not have the chance to say or do anything because I was suddenly falling into a swirling pool of blackness. Eamund and the throne room were gone, and my last conscious thought was that real? Deep, comforting darkness surrounded me, and I relinquished myself to a dreamless state of mind in which I was nothing, lost in a sea of blackness and memories that swirled around me. Time no longer mattered, for what is time to someone who is cut off from everything? They had traveled through the night, not stopping even when their flagging strength began to slow them. Behind them, lines of torch-bearing horsemen searched around Gilead for their trail. Not, thought Brahm with some satisfaction, that they will find it. He had made sure to destroy any signs of their trail with magic, and had been doing the same as they rode. With a little luck, they would discourage the soldiers who would assume they had flown away on Saphira. He knew it was dangerous to use Aaron's power, but if this was not an emergency situation, then what was? After many bleary hours, dawn lightened the sky. By unspoken consent, the three riders stopped the horses. "We have to make camp," said Iragan wearily. "I must sleep, whether they catch us or not." The rider was feeling the effects of his enforced fast, the drug, and then the magic he had used during the escape. He had to rest soon, or he would fall off his horse. "Agreed," said Brahm and Murtagh at the same time. Brahm glanced up at the sky, looking for Saphira, but saw nothing but the inky blackness. Turning to Aragan, he asked, "Will you ask Saphira to land? We can meet her at a campsite of her choosing." Brahm was worried not only for Arya, but the pale-faced Zoe who had been unable to walk out of her cell. The idea of her under Durza had terrified him just as much as thinking of Aragan in those cells had. He would not be able to rest easy until he made sure that she was all right and safely back on her mare, laughing and joining in Aragan's lessons. They followed Saphira's directions and found her drinking from a stream at the base of a small cliff. Both Zoe and Arya were still on her back. Saphira greeted all of them with a soft bugle, and both Iragan and Brahm dismounted and went to her while Murtagh picketed the horses and set up camp. Before either Brahm or Iragan could say or do anything, Saphira lowered her head and said, "Zoe fell asleep some time during the flight, but it is an unnatural sleep. I worry that there is something wrong." Brahm fought the rising panic as he climbed up to the saddle. Sure enough, Zoe was slumped against Arya's back, and her face was as pale as white marble. If he had not immediately checked for a pulse, he would have thought she was dead, but there was a beat, however, faintly. "Saphira says Zoe is unconscious." Brahm looked down and saw Iragan looking up at him, his face worried. Brahm nodded, not trusting that his voice would be calm enough to speak. As quickly as he could, Brahm undid the straps before lowering Zoe to Iragan, who passed her to Murtagh. Brahm then passed Arya to Iragan before joining the others at the base of the cliff. Saphira rested her head beside Iragan, and the rider absently stroked her head. While the others tried to regain a little of their strength, the old storyteller was watching the unmoving figure of Zoe. What had happened to send her to this deep, almost trance-like sleep? It was not unlike the sleep that elves sometimes used. Murtagh was the first to break the silence, and when he did, his voice was worried. "What is wrong with Zoe? What about Arya?" We can't stay here long, but I fear that both of them will need extensive healing. Brahm was forced to admit that Murtagh had a point. The longer they remained in one's place, the closer the soldiers got to them. In as calm a voice as he could muster, Brahm said, "Murtagh, will you make some dinner? We would all think better with full stomachs. Don't worry about the smoke. I will deal with it using magic, and the soldiers won't be able to see it." Murtagh looked reluctant, but did as Brahm asked. Continuing on, Brahm said, "Iragan, I want you to help me see to Arya and Zoe." Iragan moved over to where Arya and Zoe lay, and Brahm joined him. With deft movements, Brahm slipped Zoe's weapons off and placed them beside the unconscious girl. He slipped off her leather-over jacket and raised the thin white shirt she wore beneath it. The sight of her badly bruised chest made the old rider suck in his breath with anger, while Iragan gasped in horror. Zoe's chest was one massive bruise. From what Brahm could see, at least 3 of Zoe's ribs were broken, and another 2 cracked. A quick feel of the bones confirmed what he had first seen. The injury, however, did not answer why Zoe was unconscious. Thinking out loud, Brahm said, "Broken ribs do not cause someone to fall into this kind of trance. Did Zoe say if she was given anything imprison Murtagh?" Murtagh raised his head and met Brahm's eyes. "Yes, she said Durza gave her a drug. Do you think there is more to it?" Brahm did think there was. In fact, he was beginning to think the situation was far graver than ever before. Somewhere a little voice seemed to whisper, Durza gave her some skilna brog, enough to kill her in a few days if she did escape. Deep down, Brahm knew that that little voice was right, and that they had no antidote to save Zoe. That little voice had saved him before. It had guided him when he was in situations like this one, and it had never been wrong. Call it intuition or something else, but Brahm was eternally grateful for its help and the warnings it had given him. Looking back at Zoe's immobile, beautiful face, he said, "I have only seen elves fall into a sleep like this. I think Zoe did this on purpose to slow the progress of a poison. The same poison that Durza gave to Arya, though he gave Zoe less, just enough to kill her if she remained conscious within a few days of travel. Zoe must have realized what he did and fell into the trance, though why she told no one of the poison is a mystery to me." Silence fell, horrified silence, as all present digested just what Brahm had said. Murtagh found his voice first, and said in a strangled whisper, "You already gave the antidote to Arya. Where can we find some more?" Murtagh's thoughts raced as he came to terms with what Brahm had just said. Why had she not told him, or Iragan, or Saphira, or Brahm the moment they found her? Or had she known then? Surely Durza would have told her, if only to destroy any hope she had of escaping. Murtagh clenched his jaw. When Druza returned, he would make sure to destroy the shade as painfully as possible. He would just have to beat a long list of people to it. Brahm closed his eyes and said, "The only ones with the antidote are the elves and the Varden. I do not know how long Zoe can remain in this trance, but she would not have more than a few weeks." Brahm opened his eyes and saw a glint of determination enter Saphira, Iragan, and Murtagh's eyes. Saphira said, "Then we must make haste and take her to the Varden." The dragon was fiercely determined to save the girl that had helped them so often since they had first met her. Saphira would not let the person who had become one of her greatest friends die, just because they were not willing to push themselves to the limit of their endurance. If she had to, she, Saphira, last female dragon in Alagaesia, would fly Zoe all the way to the Varden or the elves without stopping. "Yes," said Iragan determinedly, his voice steely. "Zoe's done so much for us we can't do anything but try our hardest to get her the antidote." Brahm glanced at Murtagh and saw how tight his jaw was and the glint of fierce determination in his dark eyes. It was the same look that Morzin had worn when faced with a challenge, and now to see it on his son's face filled Brahm with a mix of emotions. In some ways, he welcomed the kind of single-minded intensity that had been a trademark of Morzin, but he also worried that it would lead Murtagh down the same bloody path as his father. "Not," thought Brahm, "if I can help it." He had come to see Murtagh in an almost fatherly way, and he was determined not fail the boy as he had failed Selina. Murtagh would never become his father, not as long as he, Brahm, was around. Pushing those thoughts away, he turned his attention again to Zoe and Arya, both of who still needed healing, or at least as much healing as he and Iragan could give them. "Come, Iragan," said Brahm as he placed his hand on Zoe's broken ribs. You must help me heal her broken bones, and then we will have to help Arya. We must hurry." After tending to Zoe, they turned their attention to the battered elf. The sight of Arya's numerous bruises, cuts, burns, whiplashes, and scars filled all of them with anger and horror. Even Brahm, who had seen much of this kind of cruelty, still found it to be utterly shocking. While both he and Eragon worked quickly and efficiently, sometimes borrowing Saphira's energy when they became very tired, it still took them many hours before they had completed their work. With the idea of preserving as much energy as they could, both Brahm and Eragon had passed over injuries that were non-life-threatening, instead focusing their efforts on ones that were. Murtagh watched from the small campfire, occasionally offering Brahm and Eragon food when they took a respite, but otherwise his thoughts were trained on the unmoving Zoe, as if by thinking of her constantly, he could somehow slow the poison spreading through her body. At long last, Brahm rose from his position beside Arya and rubbed his aching temples. Eragon rose as well, trembling from the effort of the magic. "Is it done?" asked Murtagh. He was anxious to be gone, and he could not deny that he resented Arya a little bit. It was because of her that they had come to Gilead, and that had led to Zoe's capture, which had then caused this mess. If they had not come to Gilead, Zoe would not be dying from a rare poison. It was not fair of him, and he knew it, but he wanted to blame something or someone for this mess, and Arya just so happened to be the perfect excuse. Eragon nodded. "Yes. Will she live?" Brahm sighed tiredly and said, "She will need to sleep for a few days, but elves heal remarkably fast. I wouldn't be surprised if she is conscious by tomorrow morning." "We'd better start riding," said Eragon, glancing up at the bright blue sky. Murtagh nodded and quickly readied the horses, while Brahm and Eragon lifted Arya and Zoe onto Saphira. With any traces of their camp destroyed, whether by hand or with magic, they departed. Tired eyes fixed firmly on the distant horizon, and all their hopes thrown onto the slim chance of making it to the Varden before it was too late. 15. Chapter 16. I am so sorry, but life, horse shows, summer vacation, etc. kind of got in the way of regular writing posting, but never fear, I have been writing and will be positing some chapters very soon. So enjoy this, and of course, tell me what you think. Thank you to everyone. Where was she? Arya had the vague impression that she was flying, but that couldn't be possible. How could she be flying? Had she finally lost her mind? Surely this was just an illusion of flying. Or, if she really was flying, it meant she was on her way to Galbatorix, and that thought terrified her so much that she wished she had gone mad. Better mad than that fate, but better to face the truth now. She would never run from the truth. With great effort, Arya opened her eyes, blinking at the blinding sunlight that hurt her eyes after her long imprisonment in the darkness of Gilead. It took a moment for the elf to adjust to the bright light, and when she finally could see clearly, she cried out in amazement. She must have gone mad, for never in her life did she expect to be flying on this dragon. She had flown with Glida once, and that was only because Glida wished to show her the joys of flight. This was not Glida or Shruiken, but could it be? That azure blue was terribly familiar, but only in her wildest dreams did she imagine flying on the back of the dragon whose egg she had carried across Alagaesia. Yet it had to be. Here she, Arya, was, and she knew deep down that she was not dreaming. This was real. It was then that a vast and distinctly dragon mind touched her thoughts. This dragon's mind was smaller than Glida's and full of a different kind of music that was beautiful, proud, and completely unique. This dragon was young and full of fire that had not been dimmed by the ages or the loss of all that it held dear. In a gentle tone, the dragon said, "How are you, little one?" Arya was speechless and overwhelmed. She was unable to fully grasp the situation, let alone speak to the very dragon she had been waiting for years to hatch. She sacrificed her relationship with her mother, her life, and Phelan for this dragon. Even thinking of her dead companion made her heart constrict with sadness. When she did finally find her voice, she did not recite the carefully worded speech she had planned for this moment in time, nor did she make any attempt to conceal her turbulent emotions. Rather, she acted as unprincess-like as she had ever acted in all of her 100 years. How did I end up here? What do I call you? Where is?" The dragon interrupted her, amusement coloring her thoughts and emotions. "I am Saphira." If you can hold in your questions for a little while longer, I will allow Brahm to answer them. We will be landing soon, and it would be better to discuss these matters then. It took all of Arya's patience to agree to Saphira's request, but the idea of refusing the dragon required too much energy, and when it came right down to it, it was terribly rude to disagree with a dragon on such a simple mat. So, while Saphira began to angle her flight towards the distant ground, Arya turned her attention to her surroundings. The first thing she noticed was that she was not alone on Saphira's back. Strapped into the saddle in front of her was a human girl of about 16, maybe 17 years. She was quite beautiful, and unlike any other human Arya had seen in Alagaesia. Her hair was a rich dark brown, almost black, with lighter highlights of gold and brown that caught the light. Her pale, lovely face was at odds with the weapon she carried, which, while of beautiful design, showed signs of battle. This girl looked like some sort of highborn lady, not that she could possibly be one. Why would a noble woman be flying with Saphira? Could this be the mysterious Zoe that had contacted her in her cell and offered a tantalizing promise of freedom? With no way to immediately answer her question, Arya had to content herself with observing the land that Saphira flew over. It varied from dense forests to open fields, and Arya wondered where in the Empire they were. How long had she been unconscious, and why was she not dead from the poison? If she had to guess, she would estimate that they were somewhere close to Gilead, maybe 3 or 4 days' travel away from the city. Pushing away her thoughts, Arya allowed herself to simply admire the sunset. The golden light spread across the land, and Arya could not help but smile widely. She was free. It was enough to make her giddy with joy. Saphira landed in a small, sheltered clearing, and when she had settled her wings, Saphira spoke. "They will be here soon." Arya nodded in understanding and loosened the straps on the saddle that had held her place. When they were undone, she gingerly lowered herself to the ground. Her body, while healed, was still very sore and bruised. It would take time before she felt herself again. The sounds of horses made Arya turn, and she watched as 4 horses and 3 riders entered the clearing. One horse, a steel-gray mare, was being led by one of the riders. All of them had the hoods of their cloaks up, but not enough to completely cover their features. She immediately recognized Brahm. What with his grizzled beard and weathered face, he was as unchanged as he had been years ago when she had first met him in Du Weldenvarden. Perhaps there were a few more grey hairs, and his eyes looked tired, but it was still him, unshakable, ruthless, kind, loyal, and brilliant. One of the few people who Arya trusted without question. Someone who could play the games of power without making a single mistake and end up farther ahead than you thought possible. Beside him, on a red bay horse, was a young human. His brown eyes were intense, and his hair was light brown. Beside him was a dark-eyed, dark-haired boy of around the same age. Both of them sat their horses with ease, and they wore their weapons with confidence that spoke of proficiency and skill. Brahm drew his white stallion to a halt, and with a small smile he said, with perfect pronunciation, "Atra estoni ono thelduin Arya Drurtning." Arya inclined her head and replied, "Morana lifa union H jarta ana Bramvada." Finishing the ancient greeting, Brahm said, "Undu Ivarinya." Unable to contain the questions that had been bothering her ever since she had awoken, Arya said, "Will you please explain things to me, Bramvada?" A worried expression crossed Brahm's face as he replied, "Yes, I will to the best of my abilities, but we can linger here only long enough to have a meal, and then we must continue on. Much of the story will have to be told while we travel." Arya nodded in understanding and waited while the 3 cared for their horses, removed the girl from Saphira's back, started a fire, and then finally, when all of them were seated by the small fire and some vegetable stew was cooking, did Brahm begin to explain matters to her. With a gesture towards the dark boy on his left, Brahm said, "Let me introduce you to Murtagh." Murtagh inclined his head in greeting, "And rider Iragan." Arya's eyes opened slightly with shock. This boy was the rider. For some reason, she had imagined that Saphira's rider was not with Brahm and his companions, but would be soon. This boy was barely 17, and he looked far too weak to ever stand up to any powerful magician or swordsman. Then there was his name. Iragan was such a powerful name, and could this boy live up to it? Arya had serious doubts. As if guessing her thoughts, Iragan did not meet her eyes, but rather kept his firmly fixed on the flickering flames. Remembering the manners drilled into her, Arya automatically greeted the two with the same greeting as she had Brahm, and to her utmost surprise, they responded correctly. Iragan even had a passable accent, while Murtagh lacked the same flow that came with practice. It had been a test she had unknowingly set for them, and they had both passed it with full marks. Perhaps they were not as ignorant of the world outside the Empire as she had thought. Now, Arya, to fully explain this situation, I must go back to the time when I was searching for Saphira's egg. Brahm settled back, and his face became clouded as he thought back over all the complicated twists and choices that had brought them to this moment. Pushing those thoughts away, Brahm continued with his narrative, leaving out Murtagh's past and the truth of his parentage, as well as a full description of Zoe's skills and knowledge, though he hid nothing else from the elf. On the outside, Arya was impassive as she listened to revelation after revelation, but on the inside she was reeling. Never had she imagined that Brahm was a father, nor could she have guessed, even in her wildest dreams, that Zoe was actually from a world as vastly different to Alagaesia as an elf was to a dwarf. She felt pity and sympathy for the girl who had helped her in Gilead, but was now slowly dying. Brahm had just gotten to the part when they had arrived in Dras Leona when Murtagh interrupted him. We should continue this conversation from our horses. His tone was brusque, and Arya could not help but wonder at his rude interruption of Brahm. No elf or member of the Varden would have dared to interrupt Brahm in such a way. However, Brahm did not seem angry, nor did he reprimand Murtagh. Instead, he nodded his head in agreement. "Before we do," said Iragan, "how will Arya travel? Saphira is more than willing to continue carrying her and Zoe." Brahm stood, and all turned to watch him, waiting for his answer. "Arya can ride melonless for now." "Another thing," said Saphira, "that must be dealt with now is how we will get to the Varden. What route should we take?" Brahm removed the map of Alagaesia from his saddle bags before spreading it out on the ground. Everyone clustered around the paper examining it. Pointing at a small dot labeled Gilead, Brahm said, "We are a little south was of Gilead. If we continue on our current path, we will be able to cross the Haderach Desert's most southeastern corner. We will escape the Empire and be that much closer to the bears." Murtagh gaped at Brahm in shocked horror. "You are suggesting that we cross one of the largest, most inhospitable pieces of land. The Haderach is filled with poisonous snakes, inedible plants." Before Murtagh could continue in his long list, Brahm interrupted him. "What other choice do we have? Our destination is the Varden. Besides, we will not be traveling through the middle of the desert, but only through a small piece of it. We cannot get to the elves fast enough. Surda is full of too many Empire spies, and besides, we could not get to Surda without being captured by the Empire. Too many towns and villages separate us. Added to that is the fact that the Varden have the antidote for Zoe and need our assistance. You know the reasons as well as everyone else, Murtagh." Iragan examined the map closely and traced the proposed path with his finger. "If this map is accurate, then the distance from here to the bears is about the same that we traveled on our way to Gilead. That took us a month. No wonder the Empire ends at the desert. Anything beyond it is too far away for him to control." "Is there no shorter route?" demanded Murtagh. "Zoe does not have that much time." Arya leaned forward and said, "If we push ourselves, which we already have to do because of the soldiers, then the journey will only take a fraction of that time." "But Brahm," said Iragan, frowning in concentration, "how will we get water? I thought that the tribes in the desert hid their water supplies to protect them from being used by travelers. It would be impossible to create rain and equally difficult to make water out of nothing." Brahm was quick to reply, "You forget that there is always groundwater. If we did a deep enough hole, which is easy enough with magic, then we will be able to reach that water. Now come, for time is of the essence. With a little luck, we will all make it to our destination in time." "Wait," said Arya. Everyone turned to look at her. "Forgive me for asking, for I would risk death for a close friend as well, and I know that I owe her my life, but why is Zoe so important to all of you? She must be more than a dear companion to inspire such loyalty." It was Saphira who answered. "It is because if one of us were in the same situation as Zoe is now, she would do all in her power to save us. She has never asked for anything in return for her sacrifices, nor can we ignore the fact that because of her that we are where we are." Arya inclined her head in understanding. Murtagh quickly tamped down the fire and destroyed any signs of their camp, while Eragon lifted Zoe's unconscious body back onto Saphira. Arya followed Brahm to the horses that were picketed on the edge of the clearing. The steel-grey mare reminded Arya slightly of an elven steed. Her wide-spaced brown eyes were bright with intelligence, and her small ears constantly flicked back and forth as she listened to her surroundings. Arya reached out with her mind to soothe the mare, and gently the elf princess stroked the dark neck. The mare did not react to her touch, so in a smooth movement Arya put her foot in the stirrup, but she had no sooner put a slight bit of her weight when the mare flew sideways, away from Arya and Brahm, who stood a few paces behind Arya. Melinlas watched them warily from the end of her tether. Her head was up, and her nostrils were open to show the bright pink lining. Arya had never had such a reaction from a horse to her touch, and so puzzled and surprised, she turned and asked Brahm, "I thought you said she was quiet." Brahm considered the mare for a moment, but before he could respond, Murtagh said, "She gives Zoe no trouble, but no one else has ever tried to ride her." Arya caught traces of amusement in his voice, as if he found the situation rather funny. It irritated her. Murtagh grated on her nerves, what with the way he had spoken to Brahm, and now, the way he silently laughed at her. Arya spared him a quick glance before turning her attention back to the mare who was still watching her, as if daring the elf to try and mount her again. Reaching out with her mind again, Arya tried to soothe the mare's thoughts, but it was difficult for Melinlas, not frightened of her per se, but rather unwilling to allow anyone but Zoe on her back. Trying to convince the stubborn horse was as difficult as trying to convince dwarves that they should give up gemstones. In other words, impossible. Why don't you just ask Melinlas? Everyone turned to look at Eragon, who was leaning his back against Saphira's side, looking like he was just about to fall asleep right there. Arya raised an eyebrow, rather impressed by the boy's suggestion, but also doubtful that the mare would respond. Or perhaps that was where she had made her mistake. Slowly, so as not to startle her, Arya moved forward and rested one hand on the mare's neck. Softly, Arya said in the ancient language, "Please let me ride you, Melinlas, until your own rider is able to." The muscles in the Melinlas's neck were tense, but slowly, as if resigning herself to her fate, the mare relaxed and did not shy away from Arya when she put weight in the stirrup. In a swift movement, Arya mounted. When she was secure in the saddle, she reached down and stroked the mare gently with one hand, trying to convey her thanks. Melinlas merely swished her tail and pinned her ears as if to say this is temporary. Once all of them were mounted, Saphira leapt into the sky and Arya watched her, joy filling her as she watched the blue dragon vanish in the darkening sky. There was hope for the Varden, for her people. There was hope after so long spent fighting a losing battle. As they rode, Brahm continued with his story. If Arya had been amazed and surprised before, she was doubly so now. The more Brahm told her of Eragon, and the more she came to realize that perhaps her first judgment of the boy was incorrect. He was young, certainly, but not as far behind in his education as she had feared when she first saw him. Added to that was the realization that she had also misjudged Murtagh. From what Brahm told her, Murtagh had been not only a steadfast ally, but worthy friend to all of them. It irked her that she could be so blinded by first impressions to cast a worthy ally away merely because she disliked the way they acted. Then there was Zoe. Brahm spoke little of her skills. He emphasized the help and assistance she had given them, but said nothing more. The elf wanted more than anything to question Brahm privately about just what kind of skills Zoe had, but she had the distinct feeling that Brahm would not tell her anything more about Zoe without good reason or the girl's permission. Arya did not want to push the limits of her friendship by asking questions that Brahm could not answer in good conscience. She would have to wait. Dawn came a few hours later, but the four riders stopped only long enough for a quick meal and to rest the horses before pushing on, ignoring discomfort and fatigue. They drove the horses as hard as they could without killing them. Sometimes they dismounted and ran on foot to give the horses a rest. Though the soldiers who had pursued them from Gilead were far behind now, they found themselves having to avoid new soldiers every time they passed a town or village. Word of their escape had been sent ahead of them. Twice they were nearly ambushed along the trail, escaping only because Saphira happened to smell the men ahead of them. After the second incident, they avoided the trail entirely. At long last, The sun slipped below the horizon, and darkness fell like a heavy blanket over the world, but they did not stop. Relentlessly, the companions paced out the miles that lay between them and the Varden far away in the Bayor Mountains. In the deepest hours of the night, when the only light came from the stars and a distant sliver of moon, the ground rose beneath them to form low, cactus-dotted hills. On a low rise, they stopped the horses and gazed out. Brahm raised one hand and pointed in the direction they were going. A few leagues from here is the town Bullridge. We must slip around it now while it is still dark to avoid being detected. A few more hours of riding brought them close enough to the town that they could make out the straw-yellow lanterns. A web of soldiers patrolled between watch fires scattered around the town. Muffling their swords with rags and dismounting, the four riders led the horses in a wide detour. Arya went ahead so as to make sure they did not stumble into an encampment. The elf moved so silently that she could have been mistaken for a shadow darting from tree to tree. After an hour of tense watchfulness, they were able to mount again. Iragan glanced back at the lights of Bullridge as they trotted away. It had suddenly struck him how much he missed his home. He missed not having to ride through the night so as to avoid capture and the death of his best friend. He missed all the things that came with being part of a village like Carvahall. As they continued on, Iragan came to the realization that he missed life he had before Saphira. The simplicity, he missed wishing for adventure. Pulling himself out of his depressed thoughts, Iragan focused on the connection he had with Saphira. Surely that connection, that shared sense of the world with his partner of heart and soul, was worth it. Finally, daybreak flooded the sky. The four stopped their tired mounts in a sheltered hollow of juniper trees beside the Rama River. They had covered over 16 leagues in one day and had the saddle sores to prove it. While Iragan and Murtagh set up camp, Arya helped Brahm with Zoe. The girl remained unchanged. Her breathing was slow and rhythmical, as if she was merely asleep, and could be woken with a spoken word or gentle touch. Her mind, when Arya touched it, was guarded behind impenetrable walls of iron. Leaving Zoe on a blanket beside Saphira, who took first watch, all fell into a deep sleep too tired to dream. Even Arya found her waking dreams lacked their usual splendor, her mind too exhausted to conjure up the usual fantasies. Far behind them, in the capital city of the Empire, Galbatorix was pacing his throne room, alone except for the massive bulk of Shruikan hidden by the thick shadows. How had a boy from a little-known, isolated village managed to become a rider and escape all his traps? Galbatorix stopped and turned to look at his black throne on its raised dais. A smile slowly curled his thin lips. He could not help but feel a little respect for this boy and that meddlesome Brahm. It would make catching them and that elf all the more enjoyable. He could wait. In the end he would win, after all, he always did. No one was strong enough to defeat him. They never would be, so why should he concern himself overly much? Looking down at the letter in his hand, Galbatorix focused on the writing at the bottom of the page. Written, as if it were an afterthought, the captain of Gilead said, found with the dragon rider was a young woman of 16. She too escaped with the rider and his companions, but was given Skilna Brog poison. No antidote was taken for her. We have no leads on who she was or why she was traveling with the rider. That was it, and yet. This girl, she raised his curiosity. She must have had some sort of skill or knowledge that made her valuable to the rider. Or maybe she was some sort of relative and could be used as a bargaining tool. There were endless possibilities for who she was and her purpose. However, she would be dead by now, and any use she may have had for him was gone. He dismissed her completely from his thoughts and focused on other problems. Later, he would regret his dismissal. Later, much later, he would wish he had not overlooked such an interesting piece of the games, but that is later, when a great many things had become clear for a great many people. For now, at least, the travelers resting beside the Ramir River in a small grove of trees with a sapphire-blue dragon watching over them were safe enough. 16. River. I know this is short, but it is just a filler chapter that I had ready to go. It will start to pick up again soon. The travelers forced themselves to rise as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Iragan shivered in the rapidly cooling air as he replaced his bedroll on Kadok's saddle. Arya was discussing something in a soft voice with Brahm, while Murtagh was bent over Zoe. Joining his half-brother beside Zoe's unconscious body, Iragan asked him, "Do you think there is anything we can do for her?" Murtagh frowned and said, "No, if there was anything Brahm or the elf would have done it already. We should go." "One thing first," said Iragan. He soaked a rag and then squeezed the cloth so water dripped between Zoe's slightly parted lips. However, just before Iragan could rise from his seat by Zoe, Murtagh spoke. In a soft voice, Murtagh said, "What will I do when we reach the Varden? They won't welcome me because of my parentage, and you, Brahm and Arya, can't protect me from everything, nor would I ask it of you." Iragan reached a hand out and placed it on Murtagh's shoulder. "You have Saphira, Arya, Brahm, Zoe, and I all supporting you. We won't abandon you, Murtagh. Besides, think of all the help you've given us. Without you, Arya, Zoe and I would still be languishing in the Empire's prison. That counts for something, and no one can claim that you are anything like your father." Murtagh smiled a small half-smile and put a hand on Iragan's shoulder. For a moment neither of them said anything, silently thanking each other and enjoying the companionship that had grown between them. The silence was broken when Murtagh said, "I always did like races, and now we are in one for our lives." Iragan laughed slightly at Murtagh's words, amused by his brother's statement. "Yes," said Murtagh with a smirk, "that's the best kind." The two brothers smirked at each other. Nothing else needed to be said. They headed through the hills, avoiding the tops for fear of being spotted by sentries. Saphira stayed with them on the ground for the same reason. Despite her bulk, she was stealthy. Only her tail could be heard scraping over the ground like a thick blue snake. Eventually, the sky brightened in the east. The morning star Airedale appeared as they reached the edge of a steep bank covered with mounds of brush. Water roared below as it tore over boulders and sluices through branches. "The Rammer," said Iragan over the noise. Arya laughed and said with a joyful smile, "Yes, long has it been since I last stood by a river like this." The elf felt her spirits rise at the sight of the unrestrained, turbulent water. "We have to find a place to ford safely," said Brahm, looking worriedly down at the fast-moving water. The water here was too deep and too swift for them to cross safely. That isn't necessary," said Saphira. "I can carry you across, no matter how wide the river is." Iragan rested a hand on her side. "What about the horses? We can't leave them behind. As long as you're not on them and they don't struggle too much, I would be able to carry them. We cannot afford to squander time here deciding whether or not to attempt it." Saphira clambered down the embankment, passing his reins to Murtagh. Iragan followed her to the edge of the bank. The rammer ran dark and swift. It was impossible to tell how deep the water was. Saphira placed her front legs in the water, but quickly pulled them out when the current nearly swept her off her feet. Shaking her head, she drew back and broadcasted her thoughts to include Arya, Brahm, and Murtagh. "I am going to see how far across the river is, and if there is a place close by where you can cross. If not, then I will have to fly you over." With a gust of air, she took off. Iragan returned to Kadok and remounted. After a short time, Saphira contacted them again. "I'm on the other bank. The river is over a half-mile wide. You couldn't have chosen a worse place to cross. The Rammer bends at this point and is at its widest." "A half-mile?" exclaimed Murtagh. Iragan explained about Saphira's offer to fly them across the river. Brahm frowned and said, "I would rather try and cross without Saphira's help. Ask her to look for shallows where we can swim over safely. If there aren't any within a mile in either direction, then I suppose she can ferry us." At Iragan's request, Saphira agreed to search for a ford. While she explored, they hunkered next to the horses and ate dry bread and a few roots that Arya managed to find. It was not long before Saphira returned, her velvet wings whispering in the early dawn sky. "The water is deep and strong, upstream and downstream. You would have to travel more than a few miles to find a safe ford." Brahm sighed and said, "Murtagh, go over with Saphira first so you can watch the horses. We will have to go with Saphira's plan." Murtagh nodded and scrambled onto Saphira's saddle, behind Zoe, who was still strapped to the saddle. "Be careful with my horse," he called down to them before Saphira took off into the clear air. When she returned, Zoe had been removed from her back. With Brahm's help, Iragan led Tornak to Saphira, ignoring the horse's protests. Before Saphira could grip the horse around the belly, Arya said, "Wait, Saphira." The elf repositioned Murtagh's saddle so that it protected Tornak's belly from Saphira's sharp claws. Then Arya gestured for Saphira to proceed. Tornak snorted in fear and tried to bolt away when Sahira's forelegs clamped around his sides, but she held him tightly. The horse struggled madly in her grasp, and it took both Arya and Eragon's combined mental force to try and soothe the terrified horse. Before Tornak could try and escape again, Saphira jumped into the skyward, straining furiously to make it high enough. Tornak screamed in terror as the ground dropped away from him. Eragon winced at the sound. If there were any enemies close at hand, they would quickly be able to find them. Turning back, he helped Bram prepare Snowfear, then Cadoc, and finally, Melinlas, who was the least panicked of the horses. When all the horses had been ferried across the river by Saphira, Arya, Bram, and Eragon climbed onto her back and flew over the river. When Eragon looked back, he saw the distant lights of torch bearing soldiers as they made their way to the river. It seemed that the sooner they got away from the rammer, the better. As if sensing his thoughts, Arya said, "The rammer is an effective way of putting distance between us and our enemies. They will have journey for many miles to find a crossing." "Yes," said Bram. "Now we must worry about making it to the Varden in time." Soon, they were all on firm ground once more and traveling again. Eragon dozed even when walking. He was barely aware that Murtagh and Bram were equally tired. Only Arya and Saphira seemed to be fully aware of their surroundings. It was their vigilance that kept them on course towards the distant Varden. Eragon did not even notice when the lush vegetation that grew along the Rammer began to change to sparse, desert plants, nor did he fully register when the ground became soft and sandy. By the time the sun was high above them, the Rammer was nothing more than a distant line behind them, while around them sand dunes filled the horizon like endless rippling waves of sand that changed constantly. Arya led Melinlas through the dunes beside Bram. Her thoughts were filled with memories of her mother and the time she had spent with the Varden. Raising her head to look at the sun that was only now beginning to dip towards the horizon, Arya wondered if she would be welcomed back to do Weldenvarden. From what Bram had told her, the Varden had received no assistance from her mother since her disappearance. Did that mean her mother did actually care for her? Why couldn't she push her grief away and be the selfless leader? She was queen, and without the elves' assistance, the Varden were completely reliant on the dwarves who were as changeable as the wind. Turning to look at Eragon, who was grey with exhaustion and just managing to walk beside his horse, Arya could not help but feel slightly hopeful. She had known Eragon for only 3 days, and yet she found herself beginning to respect him. He was capable, skilled with his weapons, comfortable with the ancient language, and ready to advance to more complex spells. Her doubts had not completely been removed, but they had been eased. Young he may be, but he was no child who required constant hand-holding. Resting a hand on the sweaty neck of Melinlas, Arya absently stroked her. What was waiting for them at the Varden? Bram had told her of the twins' part in her capture, and she could hardly wait to take her revenge on them. That they had done such a thing made the elf's blood boil with anger. Mastering her emotions, Arya turned her thoughts to the Varden. She was still the ambassador for her mother, but she had been gone so long that she worried that her role may have changed, especially with the arrival of Eragon and Saphira, as well as the return of Bram. They would be walking into a rat's nest of conflicting powers, all of which were desperate to control them. She would have to talk with Eragon, so he, Saphira, and Murtagh were prepared for it, though she had the feeling that Murtagh was used to such political games and would need little coaching in such matters. Shaking her head, Arya cleared her head of her thoughts and instead tried to find some semblance of inner peace away from the questions and problems that plagued her thoughts. Looking forward towards the seemingly endless desert, Arya could not help but inwardly smile. If she had wanted a peaceful, easy life far away such questions, she could have stayed in Du Weldenvarden.